Caleb Morgan hadn't set a second plate at his table in 3 years. That morning he did. He didn't know why. Some worn-down instinct. Some hollow ache he'd stopped giving a name to. He set it down, stared at it, then turned away like the sight of it hurt him. It did. He had written to an agency for a housekeeper, a sensible woman, a practical arrangement, nothing more. He was not a man who believed in second chances. He was not a man who believed in much of anything anymore. If this story of a mountain cowboy and a woman who refused to be owned speaks to your heart, subscribe to this channel and follow along until the very last word. And drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see just how far this story travels. The letter had taken 12 days to reach the agency office in Denver. Caleb Morgan had written it in 4 sentences. He'd crossed out 2 of them, then put them back. He wasn't a man who wasted words, and he wasn't going to start wasting them on paper. Send someone practical, someone who understands hard work, someone who does not expect a comfortable life or a soft-spoken man. I have a ranch to run, not a parlor to fill. That was it. That was all he sent. He was not asking for companionship. He was not asking for conversation. He needed someone who could manage the kitchen, manage the supply orders, and not look at him like he was something that needed fixing. He'd had enough of that look. He'd seen it on every face in Hatcher's Creek since the winter Sarah died. 3 years of casseroles left on his porch step. 3 years of women from the church giving him that soft, tilted head expression that sat somewhere between pity and impatience. 3 years of people wondering aloud in that not quite quiet way people do when Caleb Morgan was going to stop living like a man already in the ground. He wasn't in the ground. He was working. There was a difference, even if nobody seemed to understand it. Morgan Ridge sat 40 minutes above the town by horseback, tucked into a fold of the Colorado mountains, where the summers burned gold and short, and the winters lasted longer than a man's patience. He ran cattle. He maintained fences that stretched across terrain most men wouldn't walk, let alone work. He had 2 ranch hands who came twice a week. Good men, quiet men. Men who understood that a job done well was more valuable than any amount of talking about it. What he didn't have was someone to hold the domestic side of the operation together. The kitchen had become a problem. The supply ledger had become a problem. The fact that he'd eaten the same 3 meals in rotating order for going on 8 months had become something even he couldn't ignore anymore. So he wrote the letter. He did not write, "I am lonely." He did not write, "The house feels wrong without someone in it." He did not write any of the true things because they weren't things a man like him put into letters to strangers. He wrote 4 sentences. He crossed out 2. He put them back. And then he rode down to Hatcher's Creek and posted it before he could change his mind. The train from Denver came into Hatcher's Creek on Tuesday mornings. Caleb was there before it arrived. He tied his horse at the post outside the station and stood on the platform with his hat pulled low and his arms crossed, watching the tracks like he expected the train itself to disappoint him. He'd gotten a reply from the agency 2 weeks after sending his letter. "One-line arrangements have been made. Expect arrival the first Tuesday of July." He'd read that line 4 times. Arrangements have been made. He still wasn't sure what that meant exactly. He'd assumed it meant a woman of middle years experienced in household management traveling with references and a practical outlook on life. The kind of woman who could take one look at his disaster of a kitchen and know exactly where to begin without needing to be told. He was not thinking about anything else. He was certainly not thinking about the fact that he'd set a second plate at the table that morning without deciding to. The train came in at 8:47. Steam noise, the shriek of brakes, and then the slow, settling quiet as passengers began to disembark. He watched them come. A family with 3 children. 2 men in business suits with the look of people who'd been traveling too long. An elderly couple moving carefully down the steps together. And then her. She came down the steps alone. No one helped her. She didn't look like she expected anyone to. She was younger than he'd anticipated, not old enough to be the experienced housekeeper he'd envisioned, not old enough to look like she'd spent a career managing other people's households. She wore a cotton dress, the color of a pale sky, worn at the cuffs and hem, and she carried one bag. Just the one. It was small enough that a person might wonder if it held everything she owned, and the wondering made Caleb's jaw tighten without him quite knowing why. She stepped onto the platform and stopped. She didn't look confused. She didn't look frightened. She looked like a woman who had stepped off 100 trains into 100 unknown places and had learned that the only way to survive each one was to look like you knew what you were doing even when you didn't. Her eyes found him immediately. He didn't know how. There were other men on the platform, but she looked straight at him, the way a person looks at the thing they've already decided is true, and she walked toward him without hesitating. "Are you Caleb Morgan?" Her voice was steady. Southern, he thought. Virginia, maybe. Not Denver. Not anywhere close to Colorado. "I am," he said. "Then I believe I'm the woman you were waiting for." He looked at her for a long moment. She held his gaze. Didn't blink, didn't soften. Didn't do any of the small apologetic things women sometimes did when they felt like they were being assessed and found wanting. She just stood there and let him look like she had nothing to hide and nothing to prove, and no particular interest in what he concluded. "The agency said they were sending a housekeeper," he said. "I'm aware of what the agency said." "You don't look like what I was expecting." "I imagine not." She shifted the bag from one hand to the other. "Are you going to tell me what you were expecting? Or are we going to stand here on this platform until the next train comes through?" He almost said something he would have regretted. He pulled it back. "There's been a mistake," he said instead. "The agency sent the wrong—" He stopped. He tried again. "The correspondence I sent was for household help, not another stop. Not a wife," she said, and her voice didn't change at all. No embarrassment, no injury, just a plain statement of a plain fact. "I'm aware. I should tell you that I'm not looking for a husband either. I'm looking for honest work in a place that isn't—" She paused then for the first time, and something moved behind her eyes. Something she contained quickly and efficiently, like a woman who'd had a great deal of practice containing things. "A place that isn't where I came from." Caleb studied her. The veil she'd drawn over that pause was thin. He could see the shape of whatever was underneath it, even if he couldn't name it yet. He'd spent enough years in this country, in this silence, in this life, where a man had to read terrain and weather and animals that couldn't speak. He'd learned how to look at things and know when something was wrong beneath the surface. Something was wrong. "What's your name?" he said. "Eleanor Hayes." "How old are you?" 26. "Have you done household work before?" "I've managed a household of 11 people since I was 19, she said. "I can cook, keep accounts, tend a kitchen garden, and manage supply inventory. I can also ride, which I suspect will be necessary, where you're going." She glanced past him toward the mountain rising at the edge of town, then looked back. "I read the agency's description of Morgan Ridge before I accepted the placement. I understood what I was coming to." He didn't ask her how she'd gotten access to the agency description before the placement was confirmed. He filed it away. "You said you're not looking for a husband," he said. "Correct. But the agency sent you as a—" He couldn't say it. The word felt like something he'd have to account for later. "There was a misunderstanding on the agency's end," Eleanor said. "They categorized the placement incorrectly. I'm sorry for the confusion. But I am here, and I am qualified, and I would very much like to discuss the practical terms of the arrangement rather than continue standing on this platform." She looked at him steadily. "If you've already decided to send me back, I'd appreciate knowing now." The word back landed differently than she probably meant it to, or maybe exactly how she meant it to. Caleb looked at her for another long moment. She didn't fidget. She didn't fill the silence. She just waited the way someone waits who has learned that filling silence too quickly is a way of showing your hand. He picked up her bag before she could object. "The wagon's on the south side of the station," he said. She followed him without another word. The ride up to Morgan Ridge took the better part of an hour. Eleanor sat beside him on the wagon bench and didn't speak much, which was something Caleb appreciated more than he expected to. He'd braced himself for conversation, for the kind of careful social performance that people sometimes felt obligated to put on when they were new to a place. The questions about the scenery, the observations about the altitude, the comments designed to prove they weren't uncomfortable, even when they clearly were. She didn't do any of that. She watched the terrain. She took in the way the road shifted from packed dirt to rocky climb, the way the trees thickened and then opened into meadow, the way the light changed as they gained elevation. She noted things he could see it in the small adjustments of her attention, the slight forward lean when something caught her interest. "The fence line on the eastern ridge," she said after about 30 minutes. "It's been down in at least 2 sections." He glanced over. "You can see that from here." "I can see the cattle aren't respecting it," she said, nodding toward the hillside. He looked. She was right. "Needs repair," he said. "I would imagine." Silence again. Comfortable enough considering. Then she said, "How long have you been alone on the ranch?" He kept his eyes on the road. 3 years. She didn't offer condolences. She didn't ask what happened. She just nodded once the way a person nods when they've received information and filed it correctly. "Must be a lot of work for one man," she said. "It is." "Then it's fortunate that I'm here," she said, and there was nothing coy about it. She meant it practically, and she said it practically, and something about the plainness of it loosened a knot somewhere in Caleb's chest that he hadn't noticed was there. He didn't say anything in response, but he didn't disagree. Boy. The ranch was exactly what the agency description had said: isolated, working, functional, and not particularly comfortable by any standard that had nothing to do with survival. The house was solid. Caleb had built it with his own hands 12 years ago, and he'd built it to last, not to impress, but it was sparse. The kitchen was adequate. The second bedroom was clean but bare. The garden had gone mostly untended and was in a state of determined overgrowth that Eleanor surveyed for a full 30 seconds before she said anything. "It can be recovered," she said. "It'll take a few weeks." "I haven't had the time," he said. "I know." She set her bag down inside the front door and looked around the main room. "You don't have to explain yourself. I'm not here to judge the state of things. I'm here to help with them." He showed her the kitchen, the supply situation, the accounts ledger he'd been managing badly. She looked at all of it without expression, which he found more reassuring than he expected. "I'll need a list of what you use most frequently," she said, looking at the ledger. "I can put that together tonight." "Good." She looked up. "I'll start on the kitchen in the morning. The garden the day after. I'll need to take inventory of what's there before I can tell you what needs ordering." "All right." "And I'll need to know your preferences, Mr. Morgan. Food schedule, any particular requirements for how the house is run." "Don't burn it down," he said. "That's the main one." She looked at him for a moment. A half second where something shifted in her eyes, and then unexpectedly the corner of her mouth moved. Not a full smile, but something adjacent to one. "I'll do my best," she said. Did. He gave her the second bedroom and told himself that was the end of the complexity. It wasn't. He was in the barn just before dark when he heard the hoofbeats. Not the slow, tired rhythm of a horse coming home. The fast, deliberate percussion of a horse being pushed hard toward a specific destination. He came out of the barn and stood in the yard and watched the rider come down the track from the eastern approach. Not the main road from town, which meant whoever this was had ridden around, which meant they'd wanted to arrive without being seen coming. The rider pulled up in the yard. A man he didn't recognize. Mid-40s, well-dressed in the way that meant money, but not ranch money. The kind of dressed up that said he'd put his good suit on for a purpose. He had a folded document in his inside coat pocket. Caleb could see the edge of it. "You Caleb Morgan," the man said. "You just rode across my property without permission," Caleb said. "You can start by explaining that." The man pulled the document from his coat and held it out. "My name is Aldous Webb. I represent the Carlisle family of Richmond, Virginia. I have here a legal document confirming that Eleanor Constance Hayes is traveling without proper family authorization and must be returned to the custody of... She's an adult woman, Caleb said. She is the ward of Gerald Carlyle, under an arrangement made with her father in the spring of this year, which supersedes. I said she's an adult woman. Webb's expression shifted. He'd been expecting easier ground than this. Mr. Morgan, I don't believe you fully understand the legal complexity of this situation. Miss Hayes has obligations to a family that has invested considerable interest in her future. It would be in everyone's best interest, including yours, if you were to simply... Get off my property, Caleb said. The word came out quiet. Not a shout, not a threat that rattled. Just a statement from a man who meant it completely and didn't need to raise his voice to make that clear. Webb stared at him. He recalibrated visibly. He tucked the document back in his coat pocket. You'll be hearing from us again, Mr. Morgan. I expect I will, Caleb said. Next time use the front road. Or don't come at all. Webb wheeled his horse and rode back the way he'd come. Caleb stood in the yard until the sound of hoofbeats faded, and then he stood there a while longer because he was thinking. Then he turned and went back into the house. Eleanor was in the kitchen. She had her back to the door, but he could see the way she was standing too still. One hand flat on the counter, the posture of someone who had been listening and was now waiting for consequences. You heard that, he said. She turned around slowly. Yes, Aldous Webb represents the Carlyle family of Richmond. Yes, ward arrangement with your father. She met his eyes. Her face was composed, but he could see what it cost her to hold it that way, the slight tension in her jaw, the careful control of her breathing. She was not going to let him see her frightened. That was a decision she'd made before she'd turned around. My father, she said, agreed to give me to Gerald Carlyle in exchange for the forgiveness of a significant business debt. I was not consulted in the arrangement. I was informed of it after it had already been finalized. She held his gaze. Gerald Carlyle is 53 years old. He has been married twice. Neither wife lived to see 35, though I could not prove the cause of that, and neither apparently could anyone who tried. She paused. I left Virginia 4 months ago. I have been careful. I thought... Another pause. Shorter. Harder. I thought I'd been careful enough. Caleb said nothing for a long moment. He thought about the plate he'd set that morning without deciding to. He thought about the document in Aldous Webb's coat pocket. He thought about the way she'd come down those train steps alone, carrying one bag, looking like someone who had run out of places to go, and was choosing to act as though she hadn't. Were you planning to tell me? He said. Yes, she said. I was planning to tell you once I'd been here long enough that you'd have some basis for judging my character, rather than just my situation. That's a fair calculation, he said. She blinked. That had not been the response she was expecting. I'm not sending you back, he said. I want to be clear about that right now, so you're not carrying it around wondering. I don't know the full shape of this yet, and I won't pretend I do. But what that man said in my yard about custody and ward arrangements for a grown woman, that's not something I'm going to cooperate with. Eleanor looked at him. Something moved through her expression, something that had nothing to do with composure, and everything to do with the fact that she was 26 years old, and had been carrying this alone for 4 months, and had just heard a man she'd known for 6 hours say the thing she hadn't let herself hope anyone would say. She looked away first. Thank you, she said. Her voice was level, professional, but her hand on the counter pressed down just slightly harder. Don't thank me yet, he said. They'll come back. I know. With more than one man next time. I know. And they'll bring the law if they can figure out how to use it. I know, Mr. Morgan. He looked at her. Caleb, he said. If we're going to deal with this together, you'd better use my name. She looked back at him. Eleanor, she said, if you're going to stand between me and Gerald Carlyle, you'd better know mine. He held out his hand. She shook it. Two people shaking hands across a kitchen table while the Colorado mountains pulled their darkness in close around the house. It was not a dramatic gesture. It wasn't meant to be. It was something more important than that. It was an agreement between two people who had each in their own different way stopped trusting the world to treat them decently, and who were choosing maybe for the first time in a long time to try again. That night, Caleb sat on the porch long after Eleanor had gone to bed. He sat with his coffee cooling in his hands, and he thought about the plate he'd set that morning. He thought about Sarah and the way grief worked, how it didn't announce itself anymore, but just waited in the furniture, in the empty spaces, in the particular quality of silence that a house produces when only one person lives in it. He thought about Aldous Webb's horse coming down the eastern track in the dark, deliberately off the main road, deliberately unseen, and what that said about the people who'd sent him. He thought about a 26-year-old woman who could read a broken fence line from a moving wagon, and who had shaken his hand in his own kitchen with more steadiness than most men he knew. He wasn't a man who believed in second chances. He'd built that belief carefully out of necessity, out of the particular discipline of a man who has been broken by hope before and does not intend to be broken by it again. But something had shifted tonight. He didn't know what to do with that yet. So he sat on the porch of Morgan Ridge Ranch in the summer dark of 1882, with the mountains standing around him like they always had, silent, unmoving, indifferent to the small human complications that played out at their feet. And he watched the tree line, and he thought. When he finally went inside, he stopped in the hallway outside the room where Eleanor slept. No light under the door, no sound. He stood there for a moment longer than he needed to. Then he went to his own room and lay down on his side of the bed that still felt too wide after 3 years and stared at the ceiling in the dark. Tomorrow he thought Webb would send a report back to Richmond, and whatever came next would be worse than one man on a horse with a document. He'd been in enough situations to know how these things worked. Men with money and a legal argument and something to recover, they didn't quit after the first door got closed in their face. They regrouped. They escalated. They found the soft spots in a man's position, and they pressed on them until something gave. He would need to be smarter than that. He would need to think further ahead than he normally had to. He would need to be very, very sure of what he was doing, and why. He closed his eyes. The second plate was still on the table, he realized. He hadn't put it away. He didn't get up to put it away. He left it there in the dark kitchen, where it had been waiting all day without knowing what it was waiting for. And the mountains stood outside, and the summer night breathed cool through the open window, and for the first time in 3 years, the silence in Morgan Ridge Ranch felt less like an absence, and more like a beginning. The second plate was still on the table when Eleanor came into the kitchen before dawn. She saw it. She didn't say anything about it. She moved around it the way she moved around most things that carried more weight than they appeared to, carefully giving it its space, not making it into something that required a conversation. Caleb was already up. She could hear him in the barn. She'd learned that about him in one night, which told her something about how loud his routines were, or how quietly she'd been listening. He rose before light. He went to the animals first. He came in for coffee second. He didn't speak until the coffee was half gone. She had the coffee ready when he came through the door. He stopped, looked at the cup sitting on the counter where he'd evidently always kept it, then looked at her. "I watched where you went for it last night," she said. He picked up the cup. "You were awake." "I was awake." He drank. She turned back to the stove and started on breakfast, and neither of them said anything for a while, and it was the most functional morning Caleb Morgan had experienced in 3 years. He didn't know what to do with that fact, so he set it aside and drank his coffee and watched the window go from black to gray to the pale gold of a Colorado summer morning coming in fast. "He'll send a report today," Eleanor said without turning from the stove. "Webb, he'll ride to the nearest telegraph office and send word to Richmond that he found me." "Nearest telegraph is in Pine Fall," Caleb said. "Hour east. So by tonight Gerald Carlisle knows where I am." She flipped the eggs with the efficiency of someone who had been cooking for large households since before she should have had to. "He'll want a response before the week is out." "What kind of response?" "He'll send more men." She plated the eggs and set them on the table and sat down across from him with the steadiness of someone who had already done their panicking privately at some earlier hour and come out the other side. Men with more legal standing than Webb. Webb was a finder. What comes next will be enforcers. Caleb looked at her across the table. You've thought this through. I've been thinking about nothing else for 4 months, she said. I've run every version of it. They find me, they don't find me, they find me, and I'm somewhere with allies, they find me, and I'm somewhere alone. She picked up her fork. This is the first version where I'm not alone. I told you last night I'm not sending you back. I know what you told me. She met his eyes. I'm not questioning that. I'm telling you what's coming so you can decide with full information. Because men who make decisions about helping me without full information tend to walk it back when the full information arrives. That landed. He felt it. I don't walk things back, he said. I've heard that before. Not from me, you haven't. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she nodded once the way she'd nodded on the wagon when he told her he'd been alone 3 years filing the information reserving judgment. All right, she said. Then here's the full information. She told him over breakfast, and she told it plainly, the way someone tells a thing they've rehearsed so many times in private that all the emotion has been worn smooth off the surface of it. What remained was just the shape, the facts. Her father was Arthur Hayes, owner of Hayes Mercantile, or what had been Hayes Mercantile before a series of bad investments and a worse business partner had stripped it to the bones. Gerald Carlyle had moved in like weather. He hadn't done anything dramatic. He hadn't threatened. He had simply presented Arthur Hayes with the mathematics of his situation, the debt, the collapsed credit, the inability to rebuild without outside capital, and then presented the solution. Eleanor. Not in those words. Men like Carlyle never used those words. He'd framed it as an opportunity, a family alliance, a chance for Eleanor to build a comfortable life with a man of means, while her father's business troubles quietly resolved themselves. Arthur Hayes had signed the agreement on a Tuesday. Eleanor had been told on Wednesday. She'd had until Friday to produce an objection she already knew no one would listen to. She left Thursday night. Your father signed a legal document, Caleb said. Yes. Giving Carlyle what exactly? Guardianship that's not. It was structured as an engagement contract with binding terms, Eleanor said. Carlyle's lawyers wrote it. They're very good at what they do. The document states that Eleanor Constance Hayes has agreed to enter into marriage with Gerald Carlyle no later than November of this year, and that her departure from the family home prior to that date constitutes breach of contract. That's not how people work. No, she said. But it may be how courts work depending on the judge and the county, and the amount of money Gerald Carlyle is willing to spend making it work that way. Caleb set down his fork. He can't force a woman to marry him through a contract her father signed. Probably not. Eleanor's voice was level. But he can drag me through enough legal process in enough different jurisdictions that I exhaust my resources fighting it before I ever get to the part where a judge agrees with you. Caleb was quiet for a moment. How much money does Carlyle have? He asked. Eleanor looked at him. More than you, she said. More than this county. Possibly more than this territory. He picked his fork back up. Finished the eggs. She watched him waiting. All right, he said finally. All right what? All right, we need to be smarter than his money. He pushed back from the table and stood. I've got work to do this morning. You said you'd start on the kitchen inventory. She stared at him. That's yes. That's what I said. Good. I'll be back by noon. He took his hat from the hook by the door. And Eleanor. Yes. Next time you decide to run from something, bring the paperwork with you, the actual documents, copies of whatever he filed. It'll matter later. He was out the door before she could respond. She sat at the table for a moment, looking at the space where he'd been. Then she looked at the second plate, still sitting where it had been all morning. And for the first time in 4 months, something that was not fear moved through her chest. So, she had the kitchen inventory finished by 10. She had a preliminary supply list drafted by 11. She was in the garden at 1:30, pulling at overgrowth with her bare hands and making a mental tally of what was salvageable when she heard the horses coming up the main road. 2 of them. She straightened and turned and watched them come. Her hands still dirty from the garden, and she didn't run. She thought about it, that old reflex, the one that had kept her moving for 4 months, and she made a deliberate choice not to obey it. The riders were not Webb. One was older, heavyset, wearing a badge. The town sheriff, she guessed by the set of his shoulders, and the particular brand of confidence that men with legal authority tended to carry. The second was a younger man she didn't recognize, with the look of someone who'd been sent along to take notes. They pulled up in the yard. "Ma'am," the sheriff said in a voice that treated the word like punctuation rather than courtesy. "I'm looking for Caleb Morgan." "He's on the property," Eleanor said. "Can I ask what this is about? Town business?" he said. "Private?" She looked at him steadily. "Then I suggest you ride the fence line east and you'll find him. He was working the morning check." She paused. "Sheriff?" "Harlan," he said. "Dale Harlan." "Sheriff Harlan?" She pulled the garden dirt from her hands with a rag she'd brought from the kitchen. "I don't imagine this visit has anything to do with a Mr. Aldous Webb who was on this property uninvited last evening." Harlan's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes recalibrated. "I don't know anything about that, ma'am." "Of course," she said pleasantly. "My mistake." She watched them ride east and went back to the garden and kept her hands busy while her mind ran 6 steps ahead of her like it always had, mapping, calculating, running the variables, accounting for what she knew and what she didn't, and what the distance between those 2 things was likely to cost her. Caleb came back at noon exactly as he'd said he would. The sheriff's horse was still tied at the post. He came into the kitchen where Eleanor had started on the midday meal and looked at her with a question he didn't need to ask out loud. "Sheriff Harlan," she said. "He's in the front room waiting for you. He says it's town business and private." She turned from the stove. "He arrived about an hour after you left. He came from the East Road." "Webb," Caleb said. "That would be my guess." He took off his hat, set it on the hook, and walked into the front room. Eleanor stayed in the kitchen. She didn't go to the doorway. She didn't need to. The house was quiet enough that she could hear every word. "Caleb," the sheriff's voice. "Got a report this morning about a woman staying out here. Someone who may be traveling against legal terms." "There's a woman working here," Caleb said. "I hired her through an agency in Denver. Her name's Eleanor Hayes, and she's employed as household help. That's all there is to it. Report I got says there's a contractual dispute, family in Virginia. A man named Carlisle who's got a legal claim." "A man doesn't have a legal claim on a woman," Caleb said. "Not in Colorado territory." "Depends on the nature of the—" "Dale." Caleb's voice was quiet and even. "You've known me for 11 years. You know I don't bring trouble to this county, and I don't lie to lawmen. I'm telling you, there's a woman working on this ranch who has not broken any law I'm aware of. If someone wants to challenge that in a proper court with proper documentation, they're welcome to try." A pause. "But I'm not handing over a woman to men who came to my property in the dark and didn't use the front road." Silence from the front room. Then, "Who came in this dark?" "Man named Webb, last night. Eastern approach off the main road, no announcement. Just rode up with a piece of paper and a story about custody." The word came out of Caleb's mouth the way something comes out of a wound, flat and final. "I sent him off my property. I'll do the same to anyone else who comes at night on the back road." Another silence, longer this time. "I hear you," Harlan said finally. "I appreciate that, Caleb." The sheriff's voice had dropped, lost some of its official weight. "I'm going to tell you something off the record. The man backing Webb's work in this county is not small. I don't know the full picture, but I know enough to know you want to be careful." "I'm always careful, Dale." "More careful than usual." A pause. "I'm not your enemy here. I'm just telling you the shape of things." "I know you're not," Caleb said. "I'll keep that in mind." She heard boots on the floor. the door, the horses moving away. Then Caleb was back in the kitchen doorway. "Victor Hale," he said. Eleanor turned from the stove. "Who is he?" "Biggest landowner in this county. Runs cattle, controls the water rights on the eastern drainage. He's been wanting to expand toward the ridge for 2 years. Caleb's voice was careful, measured, the voice of a man laying out terrain before he walked into it. If Carlisle's working through local contacts, Hale is the obvious connection. He's got the sheriff's ear and half the town council's. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. "So Carlisle didn't just send Webb to find me," she said. "He already had local infrastructure in place when Webb reported back." "Fast," Caleb said. "Or already established," she said. "Carlisle is not a man who goes anywhere without building his position first. He doesn't move forward. He moves around, and by the time you realize it, you're already surrounded." Caleb looked at her. "You know him that well." "I spent 4 months studying every man who tried to send me back to him," Eleanor said. "After a while, you understand the person behind the strategy." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "What does he actually want past you, I mean? Past the contract?" She turned back to the stove. "The Hayes family name still carries weight in Virginia, even without the money. And my grandfather left a land trust in my name when I was born. It doesn't release until I marry." She paused. "Gerald Carlisle has been purchasing land along the Virginia coast for 15 years. My grandfather's trust includes 200 acres of waterfront property that would complete his access from the harbor to the main road." She looked back at Caleb over her shoulder. "I'm not just a debt settlement. I'm a deed." The air in the kitchen changed. "How much is the land worth?" he said. "More than my father's debt." She turned the flame down under the pot. "More than I was ever told. I found the surveyor's notes in my father's desk the night before I left. That's when I understood that my father wasn't a weak man who made a bad deal." Her voice didn't waver. "He knew what the land was worth. He still signed." Caleb said nothing. There was nothing to say to that. Eleanor set 2 bowls on the table and sat down, and they ate in silence. And the silence was not empty. It was full of every calculation. Both of them were running simultaneously, adding up costs and risks and distances, and the particular arithmetic of 2 people deciding how much they were willing to stake on something they hadn't planned for. 3 days passed. In those 3 days, Eleanor learned where everything was on Morgan Ridge Ranch. Not just the kitchen, but the outbuildings, the water lines, the location of the supply cache Caleb kept in the back of the barn, the weak spots in the fence that his 2 ranch hands had been meaning to fix for months. She didn't ask for a tour. She just moved through the property with the systematic attention of someone who had learned early that knowing your terrain was the first thing you did when you landed somewhere new, because terrain was the difference between trapped and not trapped. She fixed 2 of the fence sections herself on the second morning before Caleb got back from the far pasture. He found her coming back up the hill with the post driver, her sleeves rolled to the elbow, and her hair pulled back, and her expression carrying the particular satisfaction of a job completed. He stared at her. "East line," she said. "The cattle were already getting through the second break. I found materials in the shed." He looked at the fence line, looked back at her. "You know how to do that. My grandfather's ranch before my father sold it. I spent every summer there until I was 16. She handed him the post driver. "I also found a weak brace on the barn's north wall that's going to become a problem before winter." "I know about the brace." "Good." She walked past him toward the house. "Lunch is in 40 minutes. He stood there holding the post driver and watching her go, and thought that he had misjudged the situation considerably, though he wasn't yet sure in which direction. On the 3rd day, she asked to see his accounts ledger. Not the supply ledger, she'd already taken that over and reorganized it in a way that made more immediate sense than his system. The accounts ledger. The records of what the ranch produced, what it spent, what it owed, and what its assets were. He brought it to her without argument, which surprised him as much as it would have surprised anyone who knew him. He was a private man. He'd never shown the accounts to anyone but the bank in Pinefall, and even then, only under duress. But Eleanor had asked in the matter-of-fact tone of someone trying to understand a problem, not pry into a life, and his hand was passing her the ledger before his self-protective instincts had finished registering the request. She sat with it for 2 hours. He watched her without watching her moving through the room, picking up work that needed doing, always with one peripheral part of his attention on the way she moved through those numbers. She had a pencil and a clean page beside the ledger, and she was making notes in a hand that was small and precise and slightly slanted. "Your water rights," she said without looking up. He stopped. "What about them?" "The deed record in here. You have documented water rights on the northern creek that feeds the lower pasture, but the notation suggests there's a secondary claim filed in 1879 that was never formally resolved." He walked over, looked at where she was pointing. "That was a dispute with the Bellard family. They moved south in '80. It was resolved informally." "Informally?" She looked up at him. "Meaning not on paper? Meaning we shook hands and they left?" "Caleb." Her voice was patient and careful, the voice of someone delivering news they wish they didn't have to deliver. "If Victor Hale has been building position in this county for 2 years, and if he is connected to the people pursuing me, there is a very real possibility that the first legal move they make against you will not be about me at all." He went still. "It'll be about the water," she said. "They'll file on the 1879 secondary claim. They'll argue it was never formally dismissed. And if the creek access is disputed, your lower pasture becomes unworkable, which puts pressure on your cattle production, which affects your loan standing with the bank in Pinefall, which—" She stopped, looked at him. "You see it." He saw it. "They're not coming to take you head on," he said slowly. "They're coming to squeeze." "Yes." She set the pencil down. "That's how Carlisle operates. You don't fight the wall, you remove the foundation, and you let the wall fall on its own." She held his gaze. "I've watched him do it to 3 families in Richmond. He never gets his hands dirty. By the time anyone understands what happened, he's already got the deed." Caleb sat down across from her at the table. He looked at the ledger, at her notes, at the precision of her thinking laid out in 2 hours on a clean page. "You've been running from this man for 4 months, he said. "Yes." "And you've been thinking 10 steps ahead the whole time?" "Yes." "That's how you ended up here. Not an accusation, just a realization arriving. The agency," she said, "is in Denver, which has no existing Carlisle business connections. Morgan Ridge is isolated enough that a single finder can't watch it adequately without being seen. And you—" She stopped. "And me," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "The agency's record listed you as a working rancher. No family, no business partnerships, no history of legal dispute. Someone who keeps their own counsel and doesn't owe favors to anyone." She met his eyes. "I thought you'd be hard to leverage." "You chose me on purpose," he said. "I chose the placement on purpose," she said carefully. "I didn't know you." "But you knew what kind of man you were looking for. I knew what kind of a situation I needed." She looked down at the ledger. Someone who didn't already belong to anyone else's system. He absorbed that, turned it over. "That's a cold calculation," he said. Not unkindly, just honestly. "Yes," she said. "It is." She looked up, and her expression was something he hadn't seen on her face yet. Not the steadiness, not the control, but something underneath both of those, something older and more tired. "I'm sorry. I needed somewhere to land, and I looked for the safest place I could find. I didn't mean to bring this down on you." "You think I couldn't see trouble coming before you got here?" he said. She blinked. "I told you Hale's been pushing on the ridge for 2 years, Caleb said. "The water rights problem you found in there." He nodded at the ledger. "I knew about it. I didn't know how to fight it yet." He looked at her steadily. "I'm not a man who needs to be protected from the shape of things, Eleanor. I just need to see it clearly." She looked at him for a long moment. "You're not angry," she said. "No." You should be. I used your situation to solve mine. You came here to work, he said. You fixed my fence line. You found a flaw in my accounts that could cost me my water rights. You've been up before me every morning running calculations on how to defend a ranch you've known for 3 days. He stood up. You can keep apologizing for having a survival instinct, or you can help me figure out how to fix the 1879 water claim before Hale's lawyers find it first. He looked at her. I'd prefer the second option. Eleanor Hayes, who had not cried once in 4 months, not when she'd walked out of her family home with one bag, not when Webb had found her at 3 different stations along the route west, not when she'd arrived in Hatcher's Creek and looked at the mountains and thought, is this far enough? Is anywhere far enough? Felt something press hard against the back of her eyes. She pressed it back. The county land office in Pinefall, she said, her voice steady. We need to file a formal resolution to the 79 claim before end of the week. I'll ride in day after tomorrow, he said. I'll come with you. He looked at her. You sure about that Pine Falls where Webb sent his telegraph? I know. She straightened. But if I hide on this ridge until they find me, I've already lost. I learned that in Virginia. She looked at him. The only thing Carlisle's men can't operate against is daylight, public record, people who see you and know your name and can be called to account for what they saw. She paused. Let them see me walk into the county land office and file papers. Let them report that back. Let Carlisle understand I'm not hiding anymore. Caleb studied her face. Then he said the thing he'd been circling around for 3 days, the thing that had been sitting in the kitchen every morning with that second plate and waiting. Why didn't anyone help you before? She didn't answer immediately. When she did, her voice was quiet in a way that had nothing to do with volume. Because helping me comes with a cost, she said. And most people, when they see the cost, clearly decide it's someone else's problem. He picked up his hat. Pinefall, he said. Day after tomorrow. Be ready to ride by 7. He walked out. She sat at the table with the accounts ledger open in front of her, and his notes and her notes side by side, and she thought about a man who'd set a second plate out without deciding to, and who hadn't taken it away. Outside somewhere on the ridge, one of the cattle lowed long and low in the summer heat, and then a sound that didn't belong. A horse on the eastern track again, moving fast, the same rhythm as 3 nights ago, and Eleanor was on her feet and at the window before the thought finished forming, and what she saw made her blood go cold. Not one rider this time. 3. And the man in the middle was not Aldous Webb. He was older, heavier, expensively dressed in the way of a man who wanted you to price him at a glance and feel the distance between you. She had never met Gerald Carlisle in person, but she had studied his photograph in a Richmond Society column on the same night she found the surveyor's notes and understood everything. She knew his face, and he had found her. Eleanor didn't move from the window. She counted. 3 riders. Carlisle in the middle, Webb on his left, a third man she didn't recognize on his right, broad-shouldered, the kind of physical that wasn't about ranch work, the kind that was specifically about making other people feel small. She clocked all of it in the time it took to draw one breath. Then she moved. She went out the back door at a walk. Not a run. Running was visible from a distance. Running announced panic, and panic was the one thing she could not afford to give Gerald Carlisle, and she crossed the yard toward the barn where she'd last seen Caleb working on a harness repair. He looked up the moment she came through the barn door. Something in her face told him everything before she said a word. How many? He said. 3. Carlisle himself, his hands stilled on the harness. You're sure it's him? I'm sure. He set the harness down and stood. He didn't reach for the rifle on the wall. She noticed that. He moved toward the barn door the way a man moves toward something he intends to handle with his hands and his voice, and not with anything that could be used against him later in a courtroom. Stay in here, he said. No. He looked at her. If I hide in your barn while you face him alone, I am already positioned as someone who needs to be hidden, she said. That is not the position I want to be in when this conversation becomes a legal record, which it will. She held his gaze. I walk out with you, or I walk out alone. Those are my options. A beat. He didn't argue. Walk out with me, he said. They came around the side of the barn together and into the yard, and Carlyle had already dismounted. That was the first thing Eleanor noticed. He'd dismounted without being invited to, which was a statement about whose ground he believed he was standing on. Webb had dismounted too. The third man stayed on his horse, positioned slightly behind and to the left, where he could see the full yard. Positioned like a man whose job was to watch for exits, Carlyle was exactly as his photograph suggested, and entirely different in person. The photograph had been a society column image, controlled lighting, practiced expression, the particular careful grooming of a man who understood how he was perceived and managed it like an investment. In person he was larger than the photograph implied, and older, and the thing his photograph had hidden was the quality of his attention. He looked at people the way a man looks at a ledger, assessing value, calculating exposure, identifying what could be used. He looked at Eleanor that way now. Then he looked at Caleb. "Mr. Morgan," he said. His voice was cultivated. Virginia accent softened by years of business dealings that had taken him north and west and back again. "I appreciate you welcoming us." "I didn't," Caleb said. "You came off the east track again. That's not the front road." Carlyle smiled. It was a practiced smile, the kind that acknowledged a point without conceding it. "Old habits from a long ride. I apologize." He turned his attention back to Eleanor. "Eleanor, you look well, all things considered." "Mr. Carlyle," she said. She kept her voice even and her hands still, and she looked directly at him because she had promised herself 4 months ago that if this moment ever came, she would not look away. "This is a private property. You weren't invited. I've come a long way," he said gently. "Because I'm concerned about you. Your father is worried. Your family—" "My father signed a contract," she said. He wasn't worried. He was relieved. Something moved across Carlyle's face. Not anger, he was too controlled for visible anger, but a recalibration, the slight adjustment of a man who'd expected the conversation to go a different way. "That's an unkind characterization," he said. "It's an accurate one." Caleb had said nothing yet. He was standing slightly forward of Eleanor and slightly to her left. Not in front of her, not blocking her, but close enough that his presence was physically felt. She was aware of it the way you're aware of a wall that's on your side. Carlyle shifted his attention to Caleb fully. "Mr. Morgan, I understand you've been providing shelter to this young woman, and I appreciate the instinct it speaks well of you. But I need you to understand the complexity of the situation. Eleanor she's not well. She hasn't been well for some time. This journey she's undertaken, this running." "I'm standing right here," Eleanor said. "It is a symptom of a condition that her family has been managing carefully." Carlyle continued as though she hadn't spoken, as though she were furniture that had briefly made a noise. "She needs to come home. She needs care. She needs you to stop talking about her like she's not in the room," Caleb said. The yard went quiet. Carlyle looked at him for a moment. The practiced smile came back smaller this time. "I can see she's made an impression on you. She does that. Eleanor has always been a compelling young woman. It's one of her finest qualities." He reached into his coat. "I have documentation from her family physician in Richmond confirming a diagnosis of—" "I don't want to see your documentation," Caleb said. "Mr. Morgan, you came onto my property twice without an invitation, both times off the main road, the first time at night." Caleb's voice hadn't risen at all. "You've brought a man whose job appears to be watching for exits, which tells me this isn't a conversation you expect to go well for you if it stays voluntary." He let that sit for a moment. "That's not how a man comes to help someone. That's how a man comes to take someone." Webb shifted his weight. The third man's horse moved 2 steps forward. Caleb turned his head and looked at the third man. Just looked at him. The man's horse stopped. "I have a legal document," Carlyle said, and his voice had lost its gentleness, now had dropped to something flatter and colder. "Signed by Eleanor's father, witnessed and notarized, establishing a binding contractual obligation that Eleanor has violated by leaving Virginia." I have a physician's attestation supporting limited decision-making capacity. I have correspondence from Judge Aldrich in the 7th District confirming his willingness to issue a writ of—" "You have a lot of paper," Caleb said. "Yes, I do. And a federal marshal." Carlyle paused. "I beg your pardon." "Do you have a federal marshal?" Caleb said. "Because the documentation you're describing would need to be executed through federal jurisdiction out here, not Virginia District. Colorado territory doesn't recognize personal guardianship contracts written under Virginia Civil Code." He watched Carlyle's face. "I spoke with someone who knows territorial law this morning." He had not spoken with anyone this morning. Eleanor knew that. But she kept her face entirely still because she also understood exactly what he was doing. Carlyle studied him. "You're better prepared than I expected." "I wake up early," Caleb said. "The federal jurisdiction argument is technically accurate," Carlyle said, and the concession came smoothly, like a man pivoting rather than retreating, which is why I've already initiated correspondence with the Territorial Commissioner's office in Denver. I expect a response within the week. He looked at Eleanor. "This can be made very difficult, Eleanor. For you. For Mr. Morgan. For his ranch, his standing in this county, his relationships with the local bank and the county land office." He said it the way a man reads a weather report without threat in his voice, just information, just the plain shape of what was coming. "Or it can be resolved quietly and without anyone's life being upended more than necessary." "My life is already upended," Eleanor said. "You upended it when you put a price on it." "I offered you security. You offered me a transaction." "Eleanor, I am not your property, Mr. Carlyle." Her voice was even, clear, not raised. She'd practiced this too in the dark of 4 months of running, how she would say it if she ever got to say it to his face. "I am not my father's property. I am not a deed attached to a woman-shaped body. I am a person who made a decision, and I am standing on ground that is not yours, and I am telling you plainly that I am not coming with you." The yard was very quiet. Carlyle looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Caleb. "You're making an enemy you don't need," he said. "I've had enemies before," Caleb said. "Get back on your horse, Mr. Carlyle." Something passed through Carlyle's eyes. Something that had very little to do with Eleanor, and very much to do with Caleb Morgan. Specifically, a kind of filing a reassessment, a man putting a new variable into a calculation he thought he'd already finished. "I'll be in Hatcher's Creek until Friday," Carlyle said. He put his hat back on. "If either of you changes your mind, before then, the offer stands." He turned toward his horse. Then, without turning back, "The water right situation on your northern creek, Mr. Morgan. I've spoken with Victor Hale about it. He tells me it's quite complicated." A pause. "Such a shame when paperwork doesn't get filed properly." He mounted. All three of them rode out through the front of the yard this time toward the main road, and Eleanor and Caleb stood in the yard and watched them go, and neither of them said anything until the sound of hoofbeats had been gone long enough that it wasn't coming back. Then Eleanor said, "Federal jurisdiction." "I read the territorial code 2 years ago during the Hale boundary dispute," Caleb said. "I wasn't sure it applied, but I wasn't wrong enough to not say it. It does apply." She turned to look at him. "He knows it applies. That's why he doesn't have a marshal yet. He needs to find a federal angle that holds." She paused. "He will find one. He has lawyers whose entire profession is finding angles." "How long do we have?" "A week," she said. "Maybe 10 days. Once he establishes federal standing, the next visit won't be a conversation." Caleb turned toward the house. "Then we have 10 days to build something he can't knock down." That night, Eleanor sat at the kitchen table after Caleb had gone to bed, and she wrote letters. 3 of them. The first was to a woman named Margaret Soames in Richmond, her mother's oldest friend, a widow of means and very firm convictions, who had pressed Eleanor's hand at church the Sunday before she left Virginia, and said quietly into her ear, "If you ever need a witness to the truth of things, you know where I am." The second was to a lawyer in Denver named Hargrove, whose name she'd carried on a folded piece of paper in her boot for 3 months, given to her by a woman on a westbound train who'd said, "He helped my cousin when no one else would." The third was to her mother. This one took the longest. She wrote it, and crossed it out twice and started over and crossed it out again. Because her mother was not the enemy in this story, and was not innocent in it either. She was something harder to account for, something Eleanor had spent 4 months trying to categorize and couldn't. A woman who had watched her husband sign her daughter away and had said nothing, who had come to Eleanor's room the night before she left and had left a small wrapped bundle on the pillow. Without a word, Eleanor's grandmother's letters, her grandmother's land survey documents, her grandmother's personal record of the Hayes family property. History going back 40 years. Her mother had not said run, she had not said anything, but she had left those papers. Eleanor wrote, "I know you couldn't say it out loud. I know there are things you couldn't do. I am not writing to ask for anything you are not able to give. I am writing to tell you that I am safe, and that I am going to fight this, and that if you are ever able to speak, if you are ever able to put anything on paper, the name of the man you should send it to is Hargrove Denver." She sealed all 3 letters. She sat for a while after that, with her grandmother's land survey documents spread on the table in front of her, going over the property lines, the documented boundaries, the recorded deed history that her grandmother had kept with the methodical precision of a woman who had understood. Long before Eleanor did, that paper was the only power women were ever reliably permitted to hold. And in those documents, in a notation her grandmother had made in 1861, Eleanor found something. Something she read twice, then a third time. Then she sat very still for a long moment with the document in her hands. She got up and went to the hallway. "Caleb." A short silence. Then movement. He came to his bedroom door in the dimness of the hallway, still dressed. She didn't think he'd actually been asleep. "What is it?" "My grandmother's land survey," she said. "The Hayes property in Virginia, the waterfront acreage that Carlyle wants." She held up the document. "There's a restricted deed notation from 1861. My grandmother filed a condition of inheritance. The land cannot be transferred through marriage contract. It can only be transferred by Eleanor Constance Hayes's direct signature, witnessed by 2 parties not related to either transacting family." He went still. "Meaning," he said slowly, "meaning my father's contract with Carlyle is not legally executable," she said. "Regardless of the engagement terms. Carlyle cannot take possession of the land through the marriage contract because the land's deed restriction requires my direct signature to transfer. A marriage doesn't transfer it automatically. I have to sign it myself." She met his eyes. "He needs me to sign that deed. That's why he came himself. That's why he brought a physician's attestation of limited decision-making capacity." Understanding crossed Caleb's face. "If he can establish you're not competent to make your own decisions, then a guardian can sign on my behalf," Eleanor said. "And if the court appoints Carlyle as guardian through the marriage contract, he gets the signature," Caleb said. "He gets everything." They stood in the hallway looking at each other, and the full shape of it was finally visible, not just a man pursuing a runaway bride, not just a jilted business arrangement, but a legal architecture, 2 years in the building, a structure designed specifically to take a woman's name off her own inheritance and replace it with his. "He's been planning this for years," Caleb said. "Since before my father's debt," Eleanor said. "I think the debt was arranged. I think Carlyle engineered the conditions that made my father desperate enough to sign." She said it quietly, not dramatically, the way someone states a thing they've known for a while and have only now found the courage to say aloud. "My father isn't a villain. He's a man who was taken apart piece by someone who is very good at taking people apart. That doesn't excuse what he signed." "No," she said. "It doesn't." Caleb looked at the document in her hand. "Your grandmother's deed restriction. Where's the original filing?" "Virginia Land Records Office," she said. "But my grandmother kept a certified copy." She held it up. "This is it." "That's your defense?" he said. "That document right there. That's part of it." She lowered the paper. But a certified copy held by the person with the most to gain from it will be challenged. Carlisle's lawyers will argue it was altered. They'll argue the chain of custody is compromised. She looked at him. We need the original filing confirmed from the Virginia Land Records Office directly, independently. Before Carlisle can get to anyone in that office and have the record, she paused, choosing her word carefully, misfiled. He can do that. He has done it before, she said. To at least one of the families I told you about, the Hartley family in Petersburg. The land record that should have protected them was not in the file when their lawyer went to confirm it. Her voice was still. No one could prove how it got lost. The hallway was very quiet. Caleb said, Hargrove, the Denver lawyer. I'm writing to him tonight. How fast can he get a request to the Virginia Land Office? Faster than I could alone. She looked at him. But I need you to do something too. Tell me. Sheriff Harlan, she said. You said he's not your enemy. He's not. Then I need you to go to him tomorrow, not as someone asking for protection, but as a citizen reporting that a man came onto your property and made a specific threat against your water rights in connection with a legal action. She met his eyes. Get it on the record. Carlisle's connection to Hale. The threat about the 1879 claim. The physician's document he tried to present about my mental capacity. All of it. On the record, in Harlan's report. You want a paper trail. I want every move Carlisle makes to have a witness and a date, she said. He operates in the dark. He thrives where there's no record. Every time we put something on paper, we take away part of his advantage. Caleb looked at her for a long moment. You should have been a lawyer, he said. Women can't be lawyers, she said. That's a waste, he said, and he meant it so plainly, and without any particular sentiment attached, that it hit Eleanor somewhere below the sternum with a force she hadn't been expecting. She looked down at the document in her hands. Caleb, she said. Yeah, if this gets worse before it gets better, and it will, I need you to know that I didn't plan to put you in the middle of something this large. I planned to land somewhere quiet and work and keep my head down until I could resolve it myself. I know. I miscalculated. We all do, he said. Get the letters finished. I'll ride to Harlan's in the morning. He went back to his room. Eleanor went back to the kitchen and sat down with her grandmother's document and her pen and the letters, and she thought about a woman who had died before Eleanor was old enough to really know her, who had sat somewhere 30 years ago and filed a piece of paper that said my granddaughter's name on her own land, and who had understood long before Gerald Carlisle was anything more than a name in a Richmond Society column, that the only real protection you could give a woman was to put it in writing before anyone had a reason to dispute it. She thought about that for a while. Then she finished the letters. The next morning, Caleb was gone before Eleanor woke riding to town. She spent the morning on the accounts on the supply order, on the garden, on the ordinary work of keeping a ranch from falling behind itself. And she was grateful for it, for the specificity of tasks that required hands and attention, and didn't leave room for the particular quality of dread that wanted to settle in around the edges of her thinking if she gave it any space. She was in the kitchen at mid-morning when Caleb's 2 ranch hands arrived for their scheduled workday. Tom Buckley was 60, weathered to the consistency of old leather, the kind of man who communicated primarily through the angle of his hat brim and grunts that carried a surprising range of nuance. The other, Pete Dawes, was younger, 24, 25, big and earnest, and slightly afraid of silences. They both pulled up in the yard and stopped when they saw Eleanor at the kitchen window. She came out. "Morning," she said. Tom tilted his hat brim down, which she was learning meant acknowledgement. Pete said, "Morning, ma'am. Didn't know the boss had, we didn't." He stopped. Started again. "You work here?" "I do," she said. "Household management." "Caleb's in town this morning. He left a list of what needs doing on the east pasture." She held out the paper. She'd found it on the table with a note from Caleb that said, "Give this to Tom." Tom took it. Read it, grunted, turned his horse. Pete was still looking at her with the expression of a young man trying to recategorize something. "You fixed the fence on the east line," he said. "2 sections, yes." He looked at her for another moment. "You do that often. Fix fence." "When it needs doing," she said. He nodded slowly, like this was a lot of information to process. Then he turned his horse and followed Tom toward the east pasture. Eleanor went back inside. She was reorganizing the supply shelf when she heard a wagon on the main road. Not riding fast. Coming deliberate and slow the way people come when they're bringing news. It was not Caleb. It was a woman she'd never seen 50s stout with the bearing of someone who ran things and knew it. She had a younger woman beside her on the wagon bench, and she pulled up in the yard and looked at the house and then looked at Eleanor in the doorway. "You the woman staying at Morgan Ridge," she said. "I am," Eleanor said. "Martha Cale. I run the general store in Hatcher's Creek." She looked Eleanor over in the frank appraising way of a woman who had been deciding whether to trust people her whole life and had developed an efficient system for it. "Word got around this morning that Gerald Carlisle's been out here twice, and that he was staying in town." "That's accurate," Eleanor said. "What's he want?" Eleanor looked at her. "He wants me to go back to Virginia." Martha Cale's expression didn't change exactly, but something in it settled, became more determined. "He's been in the store twice since yesterday," she said, "talking to people, buying things, being very charming and very generous about it." She said charming and generous the way you say words when you mean the opposite. "I heard what he said about you being unsound, not right in the mind." She looked at Eleanor with the direct, unvarnished gaze of a woman who was about to say something she had decided to say. "You seem sound to me." "I am," Eleanor said. "I know when a man is building a case," Martha said. "I was married to a man like that for 11 years before he ran off to Nevada, and I know exactly how it looks when someone starts softening the ground." She picked up something from the wagon seat beside her, a covered dish. "I brought food. Because I run a store, and I know what it's like when you're fighting something that has more money than you do." She held out the dish. "It don't fix anything, but it's something." Eleanor walked to the wagon. She took the dish. "Thank you," she said, and meant it in a way that included considerably more than the food. "Carlisle's having dinner with Victor Hale tonight," Martha said, her voice dropping. "I heard it from the hotel cook who is my cousin. They've been writing letters to each other for 6 months, apparently." She looked at Eleanor steadily. 6 months is before you came here. Before you came to Colorado. Which means he had this planned before he knew where I was," Eleanor said. "That's what it means to me." Martha looked at her. "I don't know your business fully. I don't need to. What I know is that a man who comes to a town and immediately starts buying people and talking about a woman like she can't think for herself is not a man who wants what's best for her." She picked up her reins. "You need anything, you send word through Tom Buckley. He comes in Tuesdays." She turned the wagon. Eleanor stood in the yard and watched her go, and thought about paper trails and witnesses, and the specific power of a woman who runs the general store in a small town and knows exactly who is buying what and talking to whom. Caleb came back at mid-afternoon with 2 things. The first was a filed report from Sheriff Harlan documenting the details of Carlisle's visits, the specific threat regarding the water rights, and the presentation of the physician's document, all dated signed and in the official record. The second was a telegram. He handed it to Eleanor without comment. She read it. It was from Margaret Soames in Richmond. 4 lines. "Received your letter by fast courier. I have known what Arthur signed and have been sick with it. I have the original of your grandmother's deed restriction. She gave it to me for safekeeping in 1869. I am prepared to testify to its authenticity and its chain of custody. Tell me where to send it." Eleanor read it twice. She looked up. Caleb was watching her face. "Good news," he said. It wasn't a question. "The original," she said. "My grandmother gave the original to Margaret Soames for safekeeping. Carlisle doesn't know it exists outside of the Virginia land records. He can't touch it. She lowered the telegram. She's willing to testify. Then we have a witness and a document, Caleb said. Yes. What else do we need? Eleanor thought. She folded the telegram carefully and held it. A judge who won't be bought, she said. Caleb looked at her. Something moved across his face, not quite a smile, but the direction of one. I might know someone, he said. And that was the moment Eleanor understood that Caleb Morgan, who had described himself as not a hero, who had said he wasn't a man who got involved in things that weren't his business, had been building something quietly since the night Webb first rode up the Eastern Track. Not a plan exactly, more like a position. The kind a man takes when he has decided what he is defending and has quietly started defending it before anyone noticed he'd made the decision. She looked at him standing in the kitchen of his spare, solid, hard-built house on the side of a Colorado mountain in the summer of 1882. And she thought about her grandmother sitting somewhere in 1861, writing a deed restriction for a granddaughter not yet born. People protect the things they love in the future, she thought, before they know what those things will look like, before they know what those things will cost. And then the sound of a horse coming fast up the main road broke the silence between them, and Eleanor turned to the window, and what she saw made everything that had come before feel like prologue. It was Pete Dawes, riding hard, his face the color of a man carrying news he didn't want to carry. He pulled up at the yard and barely had his horse stopped before he was off. They took Tom, he said, breathing hard. 4 men. They came to the east pasture an hour ago with a paper, said Tom was being held for questioning in connection with harboring a wanted individual. He looked at Eleanor. His face was young and frightened and furious all at once. They took him to the Hatcher's Creek jail. Sheriff Harlan's deputy signed the order. He looked at Caleb. It wasn't Harlan. Harlan wasn't there. It was the deputy and 4 men I never seen before, and they had a federal document, Caleb. A federal seal. The kitchen was very quiet. Caleb and Eleanor looked at each other. 10 days, she had said. She had been wrong. It had taken Carlisle 36 hours. Caleb had his hat on and his horse saddled in 4 minutes. Eleanor was beside him. He didn't tell her to stay. She didn't ask permission. They both understood without a word exchanged that the time for staying back had passed, the moment Carlisle put a federal seal on a piece of paper and used it to take a 60-year-old ranch hand off a pasture he'd been working for 11 years. Pete rode with them. He was quiet on the way down, which was the right instinct. Caleb was thinking. Eleanor could see it, the particular set of his jaw, the way his eyes were moving without moving, running through variables, the way she ran through them, calculating, mapping, finding the shape of what they were walking into before they walked into it. She had spent 4 months alone with that kind of thinking. It was different doing it beside someone. Harder in some ways, better in others. They came into Hatcher's Creek at a pace that was faster than casual and slower than panic, because panic was a message, and Caleb Morgan was careful about the messages he sent. Martha Cale was on the porch of the general store when they rode past. She saw Eleanor. She gave one small, firm nod and went back inside, and 30 seconds later, Eleanor could see her through the store window, moving toward the back, toward the telegraph. Good, Eleanor thought. The jail was a single-room building next to the land office. 2 horses tied outside that Eleanor didn't recognize. The deputy's horse, which she recognized from the day Harlan had come to the ranch, was tied to the left post. Caleb dismounted. Eleanor dismounted. Pete stayed with the horses. Caleb pushed through the jail door without knocking. The deputy, young thinner than his authority, suggested he should be with the specific nervous energy of a man who has done something he isn't entirely sure was sanctioned, came off his chair fast. Morgan? Where's Tom? Caleb said. He's being held for... Where is he? The deputy pointed at the back cell. Caleb walked past him. Eleanor followed. Tom Buckley was sitting on the cell bench with his hat in his hands, and his expression carrying a carefully maintained dignity that Eleanor recognized as the specific pride of a man who refuses to let indignity make him small. He looked up when Caleb came in. Figured you'd be along? Tom said. You all right? Caleb said. I'm sitting in a cell for apparently existing on your property, so no, I'm not especially all right. But I'm not hurt. He looked at Eleanor. His expression was unreadable for a moment. Then he said, They said you're some kind of fugitive. I'm not, she said. I didn't figure you were, he said. A fugitive doesn't fix fence line before breakfast. Caleb turned back to the deputy. Show me the federal document. The deputy hesitated. That hesitation told Eleanor everything she needed to know about how solid that document actually was. I'm going to need to see the document you used to detain a man who has committed no crime, Caleb said, and his voice was not raised. It was not angry. It was the voice of a man stating a thing that was going to happen regardless of whether the other person cooperated. Right now. The deputy went to the desk. He pulled out a folded paper and held it out. Caleb took it. Eleanor read it over his arm. It was a writ of material witness detention signed by a federal circuit administrator's office in Denver. It named Tom Buckley as a material witness in a civil proceeding regarding the whereabouts and voluntary status of one Eleanor Constance Hayes. It bore a federal seal. Eleanor looked at it for a long moment. This is a civil proceeding document, she said. Yes, ma'am, the deputy said. A material witness detention for a civil matter requires the subject to be a named party to the proceeding, she said. Tom Buckley is not a named party to any proceeding involving me. He's a ranch hand who works on the property where I'm employed. She looked at the deputy. This document doesn't authorize his detention. It authorizes questioning. Those are legally different things. The deputy blinked. Tom isn't required to stay in that cell, Eleanor said. He's required to make himself available for a scheduled deposition if one is formally requested. That's it. She held the deputy's gaze. Did anyone explain that to you before you signed the order? A long silence. The men who brought the document, the deputy said slowly. They said. What did they say? Caleb asked. The deputy's jaw worked. They said it authorized detention pending a hearing. It doesn't, Eleanor said. And the men who told you that knew it didn't. The deputy looked at the document, then at Caleb, then at Tom through the cell bars. Caleb said, Open the cell, deputy. Another hesitation, shorter this time. The deputy reached for the key. Tom came out of the cell, put his hat on, and straightened his spine to its full height, and Eleanor thought that there was a particular kind of dignity that didn't need defending because it had never actually been touched. Appreciate it, Tom said to no one in particular, which was his way of saying it to everyone. They were back outside in 6 minutes. Caleb stopped on the step and looked down the main street of Hatcher's Creek, and Eleanor looked with him. She could see Carlisle's horse outside the hotel at the far end. She could see 2 men she didn't recognize standing near the land office. She could see Martha Cale back on her general store porch now, and 2 other women near her that Eleanor didn't know, and the angle of their attention was pointed in the direction of the hotel. The town was watching. That was either useful or dangerous, and Eleanor had learned in 4 months that the difference between those 2 things was almost entirely about timing. They used the deputy, Caleb said quietly to her, so only she heard. Yes, she said. Harlan didn't sign it, which means Carlisle doesn't have Harlan. She paused. But he found someone below Harlan who could be convinced, which means he's been in this county longer than 2 days building the reach. 6 months, Caleb said, at least. She looked at him. Where's Harlan now? He was supposed to be back from Pine Fall by noon, Caleb said. He rode out yesterday morning for a land dispute hearing. He looked at her. Convenient timing. Very convenient, she said. Tom was standing at the horses with Pete talking in the quiet short sentences of 2 men who don't need much to say a great deal. Caleb walked over and said something to Tom that Eleanor couldn't hear. Tom listened, nodded, said something back. Caleb shook his hand. Then Caleb came back to Eleanor. Tom's going to ride to Pine Fall, he said. Find Harlan. Tell him what happened to his deputy's signature while he was out of town." He looked at her. "Harlan is going to be angry about that." "Good," Eleanor said. "Angry men who have authority and have been used are very useful." "You have a cold way of looking at things sometimes," Caleb said, and it wasn't a criticism. "I learned it from survival," she said. "I know." He looked at her. "We need to go to the land office. Now, right now, before those two men standing outside it go in and talk to whoever's working the desk today." He was already moving. The 1879 water claim. If Carlisle is connected to Hale, and Hale is moving on the water rights, the first step is filing a formal record challenge through the county land office. Today. Before the end of the business day. She kept pace with him. "You have the documentation. I have everything I need." He glanced at her. "Do you have the certified copy of your grandmother's deed restriction?" She reached into her coat. She had carried it on her person since the night she'd found it. She had learned in 4 months never to put important documents somewhere other than on her body. "Yes," she said. "Good. Because we're filing 2 things today. The water claim resolution," she said, "and an affidavit of voluntary residence," he said, "signed by you, witnessed by the land office clerk, stating that you are residing at Morgan Ridge Ranch of your own free will as an employed adult woman, dated today, on the public record." She stopped walking. He stopped too, looked at her. "That preempts the mental capacity argument," she said. "If you're on public record as a competent adult making voluntary choices, the physician's attestation Carlisle is carrying becomes significantly harder to use," he said. "You'd have to be found incompetent by a court before it has any force, and a court finding requires a hearing, which requires time, which we used to get Margaret's testimony and the original document here from Richmond," she said. "Yes." She looked at him. "When did you think of this riding down?" he said. "That was 20 minutes. "I ride fast," he said. She almost laughed. She didn't, but it was close, and he saw it, and something in his face changed, something small and quick, that he covered just as fast as she covered things. "Come on," he said. "We've got maybe 15 minutes before those men figure out what we're doing." They went into the land office together. The clerk was a small, precise man named Alderton, who had worked the Hatcher's Creek land office for 9 years, and had the demeanor of a man who took the accuracy of public records as a personal moral matter. Eleanor liked him immediately. Caleb laid out the water rights documentation. Alderton read it with the focused attention of a man who had seen a great many filings and knew exactly what he was looking at. "The 1879 secondary claim," Alderton said, "filed by Bellard, never formally resolved," Caleb said. "I want to enter a formal record of the informal resolution and close the claim." "You have documentation of the resolution." Caleb put down 3 things: a signed statement from himself, a letter he'd had the presence of mind to obtain 2 years ago from the Bellard family's forwarding address in New Mexico, a note from old Franklin Bellard saying simply, "The creek dispute is settled, the land is Morgan's. We have no further claim," and a survey map with the relevant water line marked and signed by a territorial surveyor in 1880. Alderton looked at all of it. He looked at Caleb. "This should have been filed 2 years ago." "Yes," Caleb said. "It should have." "I'll need to note the delay in the record." "Note whatever you need to," Caleb said. "I need it in the record today." Alderton looked at him for a moment with the expression of a man who understood that something more than routine paperwork was happening, and who was deciding how he felt about that. "All right," he said. He reached for his pen. While Alderton was working on the water claim, Eleanor put her grandmother's certified deed restriction on the desk. She explained it in 2 sentences. She asked for the affidavit of voluntary residence. Alderton stopped mid-sentence on the water claim form. He looked at her document. He read it. He read it again. "This is a Hayes family land restriction from 1861, he said. "Yes." "I'd need to confirm against the Virginia record. The original is being sent from Richmond by a private holder with documented chain of custody," Eleanor said. My request for today is only for the affidavit of voluntary residence, a standard form I believe which requires only my signature and a witness. Alderton looked at her, looked at Caleb, looked back at Eleanor. It is a standard form, he said carefully. Then I'd like to file one, please. He got the form. Eleanor filled it in her small, precise hand. She stated her name, her age, her place of origin, her current place of residence, her employment, and her status as a competent adult, making voluntary decisions about her own life. She signed it. Alderton signed as witness. It took 4 minutes. When she lifted the pen from the page, something shifted in her chest. Something that had been wound very tight for a very long time gave the smallest, most careful turn toward loose. It was not over. She knew it was not over. But her name was on the public record of Hatcher's Creek, Colorado territory in her own hand on her own terms, and the date was today, and no one could unfile it. She looked at Caleb. He was watching her face. Thank you, she said quietly. Don't thank me, he said. You wrote it. You signed it. That's yours. They were back outside in 20 minutes total. The 2 men who had been standing near the land office were gone. Eleanor knew where they'd gone. They were reporting to Carlyle. And Carlyle, who was very good at mathematics, was now running a new calculation. One that included a public record he hadn't planned for a deputy who'd been walked back and a ranch hand freed on a technicality that his own lawyers had created. She almost felt sorry for the men delivering that news. Almost. Sheriff Dale Harlan arrived back in Hatcher's Creek at 4 in the afternoon. Tom Buckley had found him before he left Pinefall. The entire 40-minute ride back, Harlan had been working through his feelings about what had happened to his deputy's signature while he was 2 counties away, and by the time his horse stopped in front of the jail, those feelings had clarified considerably. He found Caleb and Eleanor at the general store where Martha Cale had put coffee on, and where in the past 2 hours a small and determined group of Hatcher's Creek residents had quietly assembled. Not a crowd, nothing so dramatic as that. Just people who ran things in this town, who had ears and opinions and enough years of watching what happened when men with money decided a small community was a convenient place to work unchallenged. Martha was there. The Methodist minister who was a compact and serious man named Briggs. The owner of the livery. A woman named Frances Alderton, the land office clerk's wife who taught at the school and had it emerged known Gerald Carlyle's name before he arrived in Hatcher's Creek, because her sister had married into a Richmond family and had written to her about a man who had ruined a neighbor's business in 2 years without ever once being visibly responsible for it. Harlan came in, saw the assembly, and said, "Someone's going to tell me the full picture right now." Eleanor told him. She told him all of it. Not the emotional version, not the version shaped to persuade, but the documented version. The one with dates and names, and the specific sequence of events from the night Webb rode up the east track to the deputy's signature on a civil document that didn't authorize what it was used to authorize. She laid it out the way she'd laid things out for Caleb over the kitchen table, with the same precision and the same absence of drama, because drama was manipulable and facts were not. Harlan listened. He asked 2 questions during the account and did not interrupt otherwise. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he looked at Caleb. Victor Hale was involved in getting my deputy that document. That would be my assessment, Caleb said. I've been patient with Hale for 2 years, Harlan said, in the tone of a man who has just revised a decision he'd been sitting with for longer than he should have. I have been very patient. He stood up. I'm going to go have a conversation with Gerald Carlyle. I want to be there, Eleanor said. Harlan looked at her. He'll say things about me that aren't true, she said. I want to be present when he says them. I want a witness to hear them said and hear them answered. She looked at Harlan steadily. I'm not asking you to fight for me, Sheriff. I'm asking you to stand in the room. He looked at her for a long moment. All right, he said. You come with me. Morgan, you stay here. Caleb's jaw tightened. If you come, Harlan said to him, it becomes a property dispute between 2 men, and she becomes a bystander. If she comes with me, he nodded at Eleanor. It's a woman speaking for herself to the law. He held Caleb's gaze. Which story do you want on the record? A beat. Her story, Caleb said. Harlan nodded. Then let her tell it. Carlyle was in the hotel dining room when Harlan and Eleanor walked in. He was alone at a table reading documents with a glass of water beside him, the deliberate calm of a man who had been waiting for precisely this and had chosen to receive it from a position of composure. Webb was not there. The third man was not there. Just Carlyle arranged in the particular way of a man who wants you to see his comfort and feel the distance between his comfort and your urgency. He looked up when they entered. He looked at Eleanor first, then at Harlan. "Sheriff," he said, "please sit down." "I'll stand," Harlan said. "I want to ask you about a document your men served to my deputy this morning. A legal document properly obtained. A civil material witness notice that was described to my deputy as a detention order," Harlan said. "Those are different things, Mr. Carlyle. My deputy is 23 years old, and he does not always know the difference. You employed men who did know the difference." Carlyle was quiet for a moment. "A misunderstanding. A man who has worked on a ranch in this county for 11 years spent 2 hours in a cell because of that misunderstanding," Harlan said. "I regret that," Carlyle said smoothly. "I'd like you to regret it in writing," Harlan said. "A formal withdrawal of the material witness notice signed today, confirming Tom Buckley has no obligation under that document." A brief pause. "That can be arranged." "Good." Harlan looked at him steadily. "And the physician's attestation you've been presenting regarding Miss Hayes?" Carlyle's eyes moved to Eleanor. "That's a medical document that you've been presenting to residents of this community as evidence that Miss Hayes should not be trusted to make her own decisions," Harlan said. "I've heard from 3 people in the last 2 hours who were shown it or told about it." He paused. "Miss Hayes filed an affidavit of voluntary residence at the county land office this afternoon. She's on the public record as a competent adult. That physician's document, whatever it says, carries no legal force in Colorado territory without a court finding which you have not obtained." Carlyle looked at Eleanor. She looked back at him. "You've been busy," he said to her, and his voice was not angry. It was something more considered, more recalibrating. The tone of a man who is revising his estimate of an opponent. "I have," she said. "Eleanor." He set down his document. He leaned forward slightly, and what came into his face was something almost sincere. Not entirely, not quite, but the practiced shape of sincerity applied by a man who had used it effectively for many years. "I want you to understand that I don't bear you any ill will. Your father made a commitment. I made accommodations based on that commitment. When you left, I suffered real losses, not just financial, but—" "The land," she said. He stopped. "You want the 200 acres?" she said. "The waterfront acreage in the Hayes Trust. That's the loss you're describing. Not me. Not a relationship. The deed." She watched his face. "I know about the restricted inheritance clause, Mr. Carlyle. My grandmother's deed restriction. Filed 1861. The original is currently held by Margaret Soames of Richmond, who is prepared to testify to its authenticity and chain of custody." The composure held, but something beneath it shifted, and Eleanor, who had been watching Gerald Carlyle the way you watch weather for the precise moment the pattern changes, saw it. He had not known about Margaret Soames. "That document," he said carefully, "is likely to be the subject of significant legal scrutiny, which is why we've also contacted the Virginia Land Records Office directly," Eleanor said. "Through legal counsel in Denver, to confirm the original filing on the official record." She held his gaze. "You can dispute the certified copy. You cannot dispute the original and the official record simultaneously. One of them will confirm the other." The dining room was very quiet. Harlan said nothing. He had positioned himself to the side, and Eleanor understood that he had understood what she was doing and had made room for her to do it. "The marriage contract," Carlyle said finally, "was legally executed." "It was executed between my father and you," Eleanor said. "My grandmother's deed restriction requires my direct signature for any land transfer. The marriage contract cannot transfer what requires a separate signature to transfer. You know this. Your lawyers have known it since they found the restriction. She paused. I want to ask you something, Mr. Carlyle. He waited. When you first approached my father, she said, did you know about the restriction before or after you began negotiating the contract? A long silence. That's not relevant. It is to me, she said, because if you knew before then, the contract was designed specifically to maneuver around the restriction by establishing guardianship, which means the physician's attestation was not a response to concern about my well-being. It was written on purpose from the beginning to support a guardianship claim you plan to make. She watched his face. And if that's on the record, if the sequence of events establishes that intent, then this is not a civil contract dispute. It's something considerably more serious. Carlyle looked at her for a very long moment. She did not look away. This was the thing she had been building toward, not the document from Margaret Soames, not the affidavit, not the water rights claim, though all of those mattered. This was it, the moment she said to his face, the true shape of what he'd done in front of a witness with legal authority clearly enough that the air in the room changed. I will need to consult with my lawyers, Carlyle said. You do that, Harlan said. He put his hat back on. And in the meantime, I want those men you brought with you to stay on the main road and off private property. Any property. I will not be patient about that. Carlyle nodded. One small, precise nod. Harlan walked out. Eleanor did not follow immediately. She stood at the edge of the table for one moment more. Not to threaten, not to perform. Just because she had run from this man for 4 months, and she wanted to walk out of this room instead, and at her own pace. The offer still stands, Carlyle said quietly. I'm a reasonable man, Eleanor. There are arrangements that could be made that don't require any of this. No, she said. Simple, clean. Not angry, not frightened. Just no. She walked out. The evening came in warm and slow over the mountains, the way Colorado summers did, generous with light until suddenly they weren't. Caleb was at the hitching post outside the general store when Eleanor came back. He was leaning against it, arms crossed, hat low, and he had the look of a man who had been standing in exactly that spot for precisely the amount of time it had taken him not to follow her into the hotel. He looked at her face when she came up. Read it the way he read terrain. How'd it go? He said. He'll withdraw the material witness notice, she said. Harlan got that commitment. Beyond that, she stopped. He knows about the deed restriction now. He'll recalculate. She looked at him. We have a window, maybe a week before he finds a new angle. Then we use the week, Caleb said. Yes. He pushed off the post. They walked toward the horses together. Martha's sending a telegram to her contact in Denver, he said. Woman who knows the circuit judge who rides the Colorado Territory docket. Judge named Arbor. Apparently he's the one Carlyle can't reach. How does Martha know a circuit judge? Eleanor said. Martha knows everything, Caleb said. That's why she runs the store. Eleanor almost smiled. Again, closer this time. They rode back to Morgan Ridge in the long light of the summer evening, and the mountains were turning gold and amber around them, and Eleanor thought about her grandmother writing a deed restriction in 1861 for a granddaughter not yet born, and about a woman in Richmond who had kept a piece of paper safe for 20 years without being asked, and about a general store owner in a small Colorado town who knew a circuit judge and sent telegrams on behalf of people she'd met that morning. She thought about all the women who had quietly, carefully, without drama or recognition, built the conditions for this moment. She thought about the plate still on the table at Morgan Ridge. Caleb spoke without looking at her, his eyes on the road ahead. For what it's worth, he said, what you did in that room today, standing there and saying what you said. He paused. He was a man who chose words carefully, which meant the ones he chose carried their full weight. That took something. I've been practicing it for 4 months, she said. I know, he said. It still took something. She looked at the road ahead. Thank you for staying at the post, she said. I didn't want to, he said. I know, she said. That's why it mattered. The horses climbed. The light dropped slow and gold across the ridge. Somewhere ahead, the ranch waited in the summer quiet. The barn, the garden coming back to life. The kitchen table with 2 plates on it, now regular as breathing. They didn't say anything else on the way up. They didn't need to. But when they came through the gate of Morgan Ridge, and Caleb reached over without comment to unlatch it from horseback, so Eleanor could ride through first, she noticed. She noticed the way she'd been noticing everything he did, that he didn't announce, quietly, precisely the same way her grandmother had filed a deed restriction, without telling anyone it would ever matter. Some things don't need to be said to be understood. Some protection is so steady you don't recognize it until you think back on where you were before it existed. She rode through the gate. He latched it behind them. And in the kitchen, when they went inside, the second plate was still where it had been since the first morning set, and waiting, and not going anywhere. That night, a telegram arrived by rider from Denver. Caleb read it at the kitchen table. Then he looked up at Eleanor. "Judge Arbor," he said. "He's holding circuit court in Pinefall, starting Monday." He set the telegram down. "Martha's contact says he's agreed to hear an emergency petition for a declaratory judgment on the contract validity and the deed restriction." He paused. "If we can get him the original document from Margaret Soames and the testimony before Monday's session." "Margaret can have the document to Denver in 3 days by fast courier," Eleanor said. "I'll telegram her tonight." And testimony, Eleanor thought. She can file a written deposition with the Denver lawyer, Hargrove. He can present it to Arbor before Monday. She looked at Caleb. "It might work." "It might," he said. "Carlisle will find out about Arbor," she said. "Yes." "He'll try to move before Monday." "Yes," Caleb said. "Which is why we're not going to be here this weekend." She looked at him. "What do you mean?" "I mean we're going to Pinefall," he said. "Tomorrow, with everything we have. We're going to put ourselves in the same county as the judge in public, where Carlisle's men can't take a paper out of my hands or put you back in a box and ship you to Virginia." He looked at her steadily. "We're going to walk into that courthouse on Monday morning, and we're going to be there when Arbor opens his docket." Eleanor looked at him across the kitchen table, at this man who had not asked for any of this, who had written 4 sentences requesting a housekeeper, and gotten instead a woman with a storm in her history, and a deed restriction in her coat pocket, and 4 months of running behind her eyes. "Why are you doing this?" she said. Not a challenge, a real question. The kind she hadn't let herself ask because she'd been afraid of the answer, or afraid there wasn't one, or afraid that whatever the answer was would complicate something she needed to keep simple. He looked at her for a moment. "Because it's right," he said first. And then, after a pause that was short but held a great deal. "And because I set a plate out that morning, and I didn't know why, and now I do." The kitchen was very quiet. "That's not a legal argument," she said. "No," he said. "It's not." He picked up the telegram. "I'll tell Pete to manage the ranch through the weekend. We leave at dawn." He went to find Pete. Eleanor sat at the table. She put her hand flat on the wood, the way she'd put her hand on Caleb's kitchen counter the first night she'd heard him say, "I'm not sending you back," pressing down, grounding herself in the solidity of it. Outside, the summer dark was full of mountain silence, and somewhere down the road toward Hatcher's Creek, Gerald Carlisle was revising his calculation, and in Richmond, Margaret Soames was waiting for a telegram, and in Denver, Hargrove was preparing a filing, and in Pinefall, a judge named Arbor would open his docket on Monday morning. And in this kitchen on this table, 2 plates sat side by side in the lamplight. Not because anyone had planned it, because someone had set one down without deciding to, and then decided not to take it away. They left Morgan Ridge at first light. Caleb had the horses ready before Eleanor came out of the house. She came through the door with her coat on and her grandmother's documents in the inside pocket, the certified copy, Margaret's telegram, Hargrove's confirmation of filing Harlan's incident report, the affidavit from the land office. Everything. Every piece of paper that had her name on it in her own hand, or someone else's that she trusted. She had learned 4 months ago that documents left in rooms could disappear. She had learned to be the room. Caleb looked at her when she came out. He didn't say anything about the early hour, or the weight she was carrying, or the fact that she hadn't slept much. He could see that last part, and she knew he could see it, and neither of them addressed it, because there was nothing useful to say about it. "Ready?" he said. "Yes," she said. They rode. The road to Pinefall ran east, and then dropped south through a stretch of open terrain that felt in the pale gold of early morning, like the world was showing you its whole hand at once, every ridge, every tree line, every plume of dust from a distant road. Eleanor had spent 4 months moving through landscapes like a woman who didn't want to be seen. This morning she rode in the open and let herself be visible and breathed through the feeling of that until it became something she could carry. Caleb rode beside her and did not fill the silence, which was the thing she had understood about him from the first morning, that he treated silence the way a careful man treats a tool, using it when it was right for the work, setting it aside when it wasn't. After about 20 minutes he said, "You sleep at all?" "Some," she said. "Enough?" "No," she said. "But enough to think clearly, which is what matters today." He nodded. They rode on. "Caleb," she said. "Yeah. If Arbor rules against us..." She stopped, recalibrated. She'd been running this version of the day in her head since 2 in the morning, and she needed to say it to someone who wouldn't reassure her automatically, who would actually think about it. If Carlisle has gotten to Arbor, or if the documents aren't enough, or if the deposition from Hargrove isn't accepted in time, what's our position? He was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of a man avoiding the question. The quiet of a man who had already thought about it, and was deciding how to say it honestly. "Then we appeal to the Territorial Commissioner in Denver," he said. "Hargrove files for an emergency stay of any order Carlisle gets. We have enough on the record now that an appeal has standing." He paused. "It's slower, harder, but it's there." "That's 3 weeks minimum," she said. 3 weeks of Carlisle's men in this county." "Yes." "He'll use that time." "Yes," Caleb said. "He will." He looked at her. "Are you asking me if I'll hold through 3 more weeks if today doesn't go the way we need?" She met his eyes. "Yes." "Then yes," he said. Simple. No qualification, no performance. Just the word delivered the way he delivered everything, straight and without excess. She looked back at the road ahead. "All right," she said. "All right," he said. They rode the rest of the way into Pinefall, with the morning building around them warm and wide and indifferent to the specific human stakes being carried in on horseback, the way mornings always were. And Eleanor thought that there was something almost steadying about that. The world's complete disinterest in your urgency, the way it kept being beautiful regardless. Pinefall was bigger than Hatcher's Creek by about half a proper county town, with a real courthouse building and a hotel that had 2 floors and a telegraph office on the ground floor of the bank. They came in on the main road at 9 in the morning, and Eleanor registered the town the way she registered every new place, entrances, exits, who was watching, what the watching meant. She clocked 3 men she didn't recognize near the courthouse steps, and her stomach tightened, and then she saw that 2 of them were carrying document bags, and one was in a surveyor's vest, and she made herself recalibrate. Not every unfamiliar man was Carlisle's. She'd spent 4 months in a version of the world where they were, and she was going to have to learn to think differently in this one. Hargrove was waiting for them outside the hotel. He was younger than Eleanor had expected from the description, early 40s, thin with the focused quietness of a man who spent most of his days in rooms where words on paper determined the shape of other people's lives, and who had decided early that he was going to be good at what he did. He shook Caleb's hand. He turned to Eleanor and looked at her with the frank assessment of a professional evaluating the person at the center of a case. "Miss Hayes," he said, "Margaret Soames's document arrived last night by fast courier from Denver. The original deed restriction certified and in good order." He reached into his bag and showed her the edge of it. Just the edge, just enough for her to see the handwriting she recognized from her grandmother's letters. The handwriting she'd been seeing in her mind for 4 months as a kind of compass. "I've filed the deposition and the document with Judge Arbor's clerk this morning. Arbor has confirmed he'll hear the petition at 2 o'clock. Does Carlisle know?" Eleanor said. "He knows," Hargrove said. His lawyer filed a motion to delay the hearing at 8:30 this morning. Arbor denied it at 8:45. Eleanor absorbed that. Arbor denied it in 15 minutes. He's a man who doesn't like his docket manipulated, Hargrove said. The motion was filed on technical grounds that were creative, let's say. Arbor's clerk told me he read it, said one word I won't repeat in present company, and denied it. Caleb made a sound that was not quite a laugh. It was close. What do we need to do between now and 2 o'clock? Eleanor said. Nothing dramatic, Hargrove said. Stay visible. Don't go anywhere alone. Don't sign anything that any person hands you. And if Carlyle or his representatives approach you directly, do not engage. Come find me. He looked at her steadily. The hearing is 2 hours from now. The work is already done. What matters now is that you walk into that courtroom and you don't look like someone who has any doubt about what's going to happen. Do you have doubt? She asked him directly. He considered. The document is legitimate. The restriction is clear. The deposition testimony from Margaret Soames is strong. Carlyle's lawyer is good, but he's working with a contract that was built on a foundation that doesn't hold under territorial law. He paused. I think we win today. I won't tell you I'm certain, because I've been surprised before and I don't like to set expectations I can't meet. He looked at her. But I think we win today. Eleanor nodded. Good, she said. Let's go in. They had lunch at the hotel because Hargrove said they should eat something, and Caleb agreed, and Eleanor wasn't hungry, but understood the logic and ate anyway. Caleb ate without comment and watched the room, and Eleanor watched him watching the room, and thought about how she had categorized him when she'd chosen this placement 4 months ago. No existing business partnerships, no history of legal dispute, no favors owed to anyone's system, and how that description was accurate and also entirely missed the point of him. She had been looking for a position. She had found a person. Those were not the same thing, and she had not entirely known the difference until she was inside it. At 12:40, Hargrove's associate came into the hotel dining room with a look on his face that brought Eleanor to her feet before he'd said anything. What happened? Hargrove said. Carlyle's lawyer just filed a supplemental claim, the associate said, slightly out of breath. They found something. An 1878 marriage record for a woman named Eleanor C. Hayes of Richmond, Virginia. He looked at Eleanor. It names her as the wife of one Daniel Morse, deceased, 1879. The dining room went very quiet at their table. Eleanor stared at him. That's not me, she said. I know, Hargrove said immediately. He was already thinking she could see it. How common is the name? Eleanor C. Hayes of Richmond. She stopped. Thought. My mother's cousin, Eleanor Catherine Hayes. She married a man named Morse in 78. He died of fever the following year. She moved to Baltimore afterward. She looked at Hargrove. She's Eleanor Catherine. I'm Eleanor Constance. Different women. Carlyle's lawyer is arguing they're the same woman, the associate said. He's arguing... Caleb stopped himself. He's arguing that if Eleanor was previously married and widowed, the nature of her legal status and the applicability of her grandmother's deed restriction may be altered under Virginia Inheritance Code. Hargrove said, working through it fast. It's a stretch, but it would create enough confusion in the filing to delay the ruling, potentially kick it to a full evidentiary hearing, rather than today's declaratory judgment. He looked at Eleanor. Do you have anything that distinguishes you from Eleanor Catherine birth record? Church record? Anything with your full name and parentage, Eleanor thought. My grandmother's letters, she said. In the deed restriction document package. My grandmother addressed letters to me as a child. Eleanor Constance, daughter of Arthur Hayes and Miriam Hayes née Caldwell. If Margaret included those with the original... She did, Hargrove said, already pulling the document package from his bag. He went through it with rapid precision. Found what he was looking for. Held it up, a letter, in an older hand, addressed in full, to Eleanor Constance Hayes, beloved granddaughter, daughter of Arthur and Miriam. This establishes parentage and full name on a document predating any claim Carlyle can make. He looked at the associate. Get to Arbor's clerk right now. File this as a supplemental exhibit. Tell the clerk we're responding to Carlyle's claim before the hearing opens. The associate was gone before Hargrove finished the sentence. Eleanor sat back down. Her heart was going faster than she wanted it to, which she noted and managed the way she managed things by naming it, which took some of its power. Caleb's hand came down flat on the table next to hers. Not on her hand, just next to it. Close enough that she could feel the warmth of it. He's out of moves, Caleb said quietly. That was his last one. How do you know? She said. Because he used it 45 minutes before the hearing, he said. A man with real ammunition saves it. A man who's running low fires early and hopes it lands. He looked at her. He's hoping. She looked at his hand next to hers on the table. She turned her hand over. Not taking his hand, just turning it. An openness in the gesture that she hadn't planned and didn't take back. His fingers closed over hers. Once. Brief. And then he took his hand back and picked up his coffee and looked at the wall, and Eleanor looked at the table, and neither of them said anything, and it was the loudest thing that had happened since she stepped off that train. The Pine Fall Courthouse smelled like old wood and lamp oil and the specific dry gravity of a room where things got decided. Eleanor walked in at 1:55. Caleb was beside her. Hargrove was a step ahead. The room was smaller than she'd imagined. Not the grand courtroom of her understanding, but a plain, functional room with benches and a raised desk and windows that let in the flat afternoon light without sentiment. Carlyle was already there. He was seated at the respondent's table with a lawyer she didn't recognize, not Webb, someone better dressed and more contained, someone who had the look of a man who had argued before many judges and knew how to position himself in a room. Carlyle himself was composed. His eyes moved to Eleanor when she entered and stayed there for a moment, and she looked back at him and held it, and she thought about her grandmother and Margaret Soames, and her mother leaving papers on a pillow without saying a word, and she sat down. Sheriff Harlan came in 2 minutes later, which she hadn't expected. He sat in the back. He did not look at Carlyle. He looked at Eleanor and gave her the same small nod Martha Cale had given her from the store porch, and then he looked at the front of the room. Martha herself was not there. Pinefall was too far, but Frances Alderton was sitting 2 rows back, and next to her was a woman Eleanor didn't recognize, who turned out to be, when introduced by Hargrove in a quick whisper, the wife of the Pinefall telegraph operator, who had received and retained copies of the telegrams Carlyle's men had sent in the past 48 hours, and who had opinions about the content of those telegrams that she was prepared to share with anyone who asked. People who built position quietly, Eleanor thought. People who watched and waited, and showed up when it mattered. Judge Arbor came in at 2 o'clock exactly. He was 60, gray-bearded, with the economy of movement of a man who had long ago stopped performing his authority because he didn't need to. He sat. He looked at the papers in front of him. He looked up. "Hayes' petition," he said. "I've read the filings. I want to hear from both parties before I rule." He looked at Carlyle's table. "Petitioner's counsel on the supplemental claim filed this morning regarding prior marriage record. You have 2 minutes." Carlyle's lawyer stood. He was smooth. He was precise. He presented the marriage record and the name overlap, and the argument about Eleanor Catherine versus Eleanor Constance in the measured tones of a man who was not arguing from confidence, but from delay, buying time, creating noise, hoping the noise was enough. Arbor listened. He asked one question. "Do you have documentation establishing that the Eleanor Hayes in this 1878 marriage record is the same individual as the petitioner?" "Your Honor, the name and origin." "Documentation," Arbor said. "Yes or no?" A pause. "Not at this time, Your Honor." "Then sit down," Arbor said. He turned to Hargrove. Hargrove presented the grandmother's deed restriction, the letters establishing Eleanor Constance Hayes's full parentage and identity. The affidavit of voluntary residence from the Hatcher's Creek Land Office. Margaret Soames's deposition read in part aloud an old woman's voice in formal legal language, describing a document she had held for 20 years, the chain of custody unbroken, the authenticity unambiguous. Then Arbor looked at Eleanor directly. "Miss Hayes," he said, "do you have anything to add in your own words?" Eleanor stood. She had thought about what she would say if she got this moment. She had composed and discarded a dozen versions in her head. In the end, she said none of them, because what came out was simpler than anything she'd prepared. "Your Honor," she said, "my grandmother filed that deed restriction when I was not yet born because she understood something that I have spent the past 4 months learning to fully believe, that a woman's name on her own property is not a courtesy. It's not a gift. It's a fact of law, and no contract made between other people about her future can erase it." She paused. "I did not run from Virginia because I was unwell or incapable of making decisions. I ran because the decision had been made for me without my knowledge or consent by men who had agreed between themselves that my signature on my own inheritance was an obstacle rather than a right." She looked at Arbor steadily. "I am standing in this room in full possession of my faculties, my documents, and my name. I am asking this court to confirm what the law already says, that those things are mine." The room was very quiet. Arbor looked at her for a moment. Then he looked down at the papers. Then he looked at Carlyle's table. "The marriage contract presented by the respondent," he said, "was executed between Arthur Hayes and Gerald Carlyle without the petitioner's signature or consent, and pertains to the transfer of property specifically restricted by a prior deed condition requiring the petitioner's direct signature. Under Colorado territorial law and the terms of the original 1861 restriction, the marriage contract has no legal force as an instrument of property transfer." He paused. "The physician's attestation presented by the respondent has not been supported by any court proceeding establishing limited capacity and therefore carries no legal weight in this jurisdiction." Another pause. "The petition for declaratory judgment is granted. Eleanor Constance Hayes is recognized by this court as a competent adult with full legal authority over her person and the property interests designated in the Hayes family deed restriction of 1861. He brought down the gavel. One sound, clean and final. Eleanor sat down. She had not planned to sit down so quickly. Her legs made the decision, and she followed it, and she put both hands flat on the table in front of her, and she looked at those hands, and she breathed. Caleb was beside her, and he didn't say anything, and he didn't touch her, and she was grateful for both of those things, because if he had said something or touched her, she thought she might have come apart, in a way she wasn't ready to come apart, in front of a room full of people. She breathed. The gavel had made one sound, and that sound had landed somewhere in her chest, and was still reverberating, moving through all the places where 4 months of running had compacted everything tight. She breathed. Across the room she heard Carlyle's chair push back. She heard him say something to his lawyer in a voice too low to make out. She did not look at him. She had already looked at him enough. She looked at her hands on the table. She was still herself. She was still here. She had not been erased. Outside the courthouse in the afternoon light, Harlan shook Hargrove's hand. Frances Alderton spoke quietly to a woman Eleanor still didn't know. Caleb stood a little apart from the group with his hat in his hands, turning it by the brim the way he did when he was thinking hard about something he hadn't decided how to say yet. Eleanor walked over to him. "It's done," she said. "It's done," he agreed. "Carlyle can appeal," she said. "He will appeal." "Hargrove says the grounds are narrow," Caleb said. "The ruling is solid. An appeal buys him time, but not outcome. He knows that," she said. "He'll use the time to decide whether it's worth the cost of continuing." She looked at Caleb. Men like him don't chase things that stop being profitable. Once the deed restriction is confirmed on the record and in the public domain, the land he wanted is unreachable without my direct signature, which I will never give. There's no profit left in pursuing me. She paused. He'll go find someone else to build his access to the harbor. Caleb looked at her. "You sound almost sorry for whoever that is." "I am," she said, But I can't fight every battle. I can only fight this one." He nodded. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "What do you want to do now?" She looked at him. It was a simple question, and it was also not a simple question, and she was fairly certain they both understood which version was being asked. "I want to go back to Morgan Ridge," she said. "All right," he said. "And I want to finish the garden before the summer's over," she said. "And I want to see what the east fence looks like when it's properly repaired all the way around. And I want to go through those accounts again, because there are 2 line items in the summer ledger that don't balance correctly and have been bothering me for a week." She paused. "And I want to write to my mother. A different letter than the last one. A letter that doesn't have to be about strategy." He looked at her for a long moment. His hat was still in his hands. "You're staying," he said. "I'm staying," she said. "If that—" She stopped. She had been about to say, "If that's all right," and she heard herself about to say it, and she stopped because that was the old reflex, the one that asked permission for things that didn't require it. She tried again. "I'm staying," she said. "I'd like to stay." "I'd like you to stay," he said. It wasn't a declaration. It wasn't a scene from a story about love that arrives fully formed and announces itself in the right light. It was 2 people who had spent 3 weeks learning each other's rhythms and weight, and the specific way each of them managed fear, standing outside a courthouse in Pinefall on a summer afternoon, saying the thing that was true. That was enough. That was, in fact, everything. They rode back to Morgan Ridge as the afternoon tipped toward evening. Harlan rode with them as far as Hatcher's Creek. He had business in town, and he wanted, he said, to ride through the main street where Carlisle's men could see him coming back from Pinefall with the 2 people Carlisle had spent a week trying to separate and move. He did not say this with any drama. He said it the way a man says a thing that is just good sense. Martha Cale was on her porch when they came through. She looked at Eleanor's face and read it immediately, and her expression did the thing it did when she had filed something correctly. A small, compressed satisfaction, functional and genuine. She raised one hand. Eleanor raised one hand back. That was the whole conversation, and it contained everything that needed to be said. They climbed to Morgan Ridge in the long evening light. Pete had kept the place running. The animals were fed. The barn was in order. The kitchen had been left alone, in the particular respectful way of a young man who understood where his jurisdiction ended. Eleanor went to the kitchen first. The 2 plates were on the table where they'd been when she and Caleb left that morning. She picked them both up and washed them and set them back side by side, and then she put the kettle on and stood at the stove and listened to the ranch settle around her, the horses in the barn. The specific creak of the back porch boards when Caleb walked across them, the sound of the summer wind moving through whatever was outside the window without her needing to see it. She had spent 4 months learning the texture of places she was passing through. She was learning the texture of a place she was staying, and it was a different kind of learning, entirely slower, more specific, built from repetition and familiarity, and the accumulation of ordinary mornings. Caleb came in from the back. He stopped when he saw the kettle on. He looked at it, then at her. "I found your coffee," she said. "The good tin. You hid it behind the cornmeal." "I didn't hide it," he said. "You put it where no one would look." "That's not the same as hiding it." "In practical terms it is," she said. He hung his hat on the hook. He sat at the table. She brought 2 cups and poured, and sat across from him, and it was exactly like every morning that had come before, except that something underneath it had changed, not dramatically, not with announcement, but in the way that things change when a decision gets made, and both people know it has been made, and neither of them needs to make a speech about it. They drank their coffee. "Tom came by while we were gone," Pete had said earlier. "Left something on the back step." Caleb got up and went to the back door. He came back with a small package wrapped in brown paper. He set it on the table and looked at it. "Tom doesn't leave things," Caleb said. He unwrapped it. Inside was a jar of preserves, the label in a hand Eleanor didn't recognize, a woman's hand, neat and old, and a folded note. Caleb read it. He set it down on the table between them. Eleanor read it. These were my wife's. Peach. She put them up the summer before she passed. I've been saving them. Don't know for what. Figured maybe now I do. TB Eleanor sat very still for a moment. Caleb picked up the jar and looked at it for a while. She watched his face and saw the thing he didn't let himself show. Often, not grief exactly, but the adjacency of it. The way a man who has been carrying something very heavy for a very long time sometimes has to stop and feel the weight of it before he can put it down. He loved her, Eleanor said quietly. 32 years, Caleb said. He's been saving these since she died. Looks like. And he gave them to us, she said. Caleb set the jar down. He looked at the table. Then he looked at Eleanor, and what was in his face was something she hadn't seen there in full before. Not the controlled competence, not the careful steadiness, but the thing underneath those things, the part of a man that exists before he learned to manage it. I lost Sarah in February, he said. 3 years ago. Fever came fast, 2 days, and then... He stopped. He put his hands flat on the table. I built this house for her. Picked the ridge because she liked to see the mountains from all sides. She said it was the only place she could see all the way to everything that mattered. His voice was level, matter of fact. I stayed because I didn't know what else to do. And then after a while I stayed because the ranch needed running. And then after a while it was just... He paused. It was just the life I was living, not a chosen one. Just the one that was there. Eleanor waited. When I wrote that letter to the agency, he said, I told myself it was practical. I needed help with the kitchen. I needed someone to manage the accounts. I told myself the plate that morning was a habit, some kind of domestic reflex. He looked at her. I don't think that's what it was. No, she said. I don't think so either. I don't know how to do this, he said. I want to be clear about that. I am a man who spent 3 years deciding not to need anything, and I am not... He stopped, started again. I'm not good at saying things like this. You're doing all right, she said. Something crossed his face, that almost smile she'd been seeing since the first morning. Eleanor, he said. Yes, I'd like to stop running the arrangement as employer and employee. He looked at her steadily. I'd like to run it differently. Differently how? She said, and she knew what he meant, and she was asking anyway, because she wanted to hear him say it. The permanent kind, he said. She looked at him across the kitchen table, across the 2 plates and the jar of saved peach preserves, and the ledger with both their handwriting in the margins, and 4 weeks of shared mornings, and the particular knowledge of a person that you only get by watching how they move through hard things. I want to be clear about something first, she said. Tell me, he said. I'm not staying because I needed a place to land, she said. I have options now. Hargrove says the land trust releases to my name within the month. I have resources. I have a record. I can go anywhere. She held his gaze. I'm staying because I want to be here. Because this is where I want to be. She paused. Not because I have to. Because I choose to. She let that sit for a moment. I need you to know the difference. I know the difference, he said. Then yes, she said. He breathed out. One breath slow and long. Something in his shoulders moved that she'd never seen move before. All right, he said. All right, she said. He picked up Tom's note and folded it carefully and put it in his shirt pocket. He picked up the jar of peach preserves and set it on the shelf where it belonged, not hidden, not saved for some future occasion, but present part of the inventory of a life being lived. The ledger imbalance, he said. The 2 entries you mentioned. The August supply run, she said, 3rd line item. I paid Dawson at the mill in exchange for a load of timber I didn't end up taking, he said. Meant to adjust it and forgot. So it's not an error, it's a credit. Should be, he said. I'll correct it in the morning. Good, he said. They finished their coffee. Outside, the Colorado summer evening was doing what it did, pulling the light down, slow and reluctant, keeping the warmth longer than you expected, the mountains holding the color of the sky, even after the sky had moved on to something darker. Eleanor washed the cups. Caleb went to check the barn one last time. She stood at the kitchen and dried the cups and put them back where they lived. She knew where they lived now, knew where everything lived, knew the particular way the shelf by the window tilted slightly and required you to set things down with your weight forward, or they'd slide. And she listened to the sound of him coming back across the yard, and then across the back porch, and then through the door. And she thought about her grandmother writing Eleanor Constance Hayes, beloved granddaughter, in a letter that had waited 30 years to matter. And about Margaret Soames keeping a piece of paper in good faith for 20 years for a girl she'd held as a baby, and about a woman in a kitchen in 1861 who had understood that the future needed protection built in advance before you knew what shape it would take. She thought about a plate set out without deciding to. She thought about a gate opened from horseback so she could ride through first. She thought about a man who had read the territorial code 2 years ago during a property dispute he'd forgotten to tell her about, who had spent 3 years deciding not to need anything, who turned out to be very good at needing things quietly. Caleb came in. He stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at her. She looked at him. "What?" he said. "Nothing," she said. "Just thinking." "About what?" "About how the things that matter most don't usually announce themselves," she said. "They just show up, quietly, and you don't always know what they are right away." He looked at her for a moment. "No," he said. "You don't." He moved to his chair at the table. She moved to hers. The lamp was lit between them, and the summer dark was settled in, outside, and the mountains stood around Morgan Ridge, the way they had stood for 1,000 years. Patient, enormous, indifferent to human scale. And inside this kitchen, in this light, two people sat across from each other and were simply at last where they had chosen to be. Not because anyone had arranged it. Not because the world had been kind, because the world had not been especially kind. It had produced Gerald Carlyle and Arthur Hayes, and men who rode in at night on the East Track, and deputies who signed things they shouldn't have signed, and towns that watched to see which way the wind would go before they committed. But also Margaret Soames, Martha Cale, Tom Buckley's peach preserves, a circuit judge who denied a delay motion in 15 minutes, a sheriff who rode back from Pinefall with the people Carlyle had spent a week trying to separate just so the right people could see him doing it. The world had produced all of that too. A woman who was nobody's property, a man who had finally set down the weight of a life he hadn't chosen, a home built not by walls, not by necessity, not by the absence of anywhere else to go, but by two people who had looked at each other across a kitchen table and decided with full information and full freedom that this was where they stayed. That was not nothing. That was in fact everything that mattered. And in the morning, there would be fence to check, and accounts to balance, and a garden that was coming back stronger than it had been before. And the summer would do what summers in Colorado did, burn bright and generous and short, and they would be in it together, and that was not a small thing. That was the whole thing. That was the life.